What if I told you that history isn't just strange, it's scripted? That buried between battles, treaties, and timelines are patterns so eerie, they'll make you question reality itself. Twin deaths, prophetic novels, ships that sank before they were ever built, coincidence, or cosmic glitch? These aren't just stories. They're whispers from the void, echoing across centuries. Buckle up, because we're diving headfirst into 101 of the most chilling historical coincidences that will crawl under your skin and stay there. Before we dive into the deep end of history's weirdest rabbit hole, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the madness we drop every week. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Let's see how many night owls and time travelers we've got tuning in. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. It's the kind of cosmic timing that would get rejected from a screenplay for being too on the nose. Two titans of American history, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, founding fathers, ideological rivals, pen pals, and one-time political frenemies, both exhaled their final breaths on the same exact day. And not just any day. The 4th of July, 1826. Exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the document they had helped birth into existence. Jefferson was the principal author. Adams, a fierce editor and advocate. The ink of their rebellion dried under candlelight, but what came after was years of bitter disagreement, reconciliation, and an exchange of over 150 letters in their twilight years. They debated philosophy, government, even mortality itself. What they couldn't have predicted is that death would book its own poetic ending. That morning, Adams sold, frail, but still defiant, muttered his last words. Thomas Jefferson survives. He was wrong. Jefferson had died just hours earlier at Monticello. But the sentiment was chilling. It was as if the two men had waited, holding on to life with the stubbornness of statesmen, to witness the half-century mark of the country they helped forge. It's a coincidence that feels less like chance and more like cosmic choreography. Like history itself gave them a curtain call. And here's where it really starts to creep in. These weren't just two old men with good timing. Their lives had mirrored each other in uncanny ways for decades, both born in the 1740s. Both deeply connected to Virginia. Both served as U.S. ambassadors in Europe. Both served as vice president before becoming president. And both, despite their long estrangement, rekindled a friendship so potent it spanned the final 14 years of their lives. The 4th of July, 1826, two great minds, extinguished in sync, like twin stars blinking out over a new nation's sky. It's not just eerie, it's the kind of narrative that feels engineered. But hold that thought, because if you think this was history's most chilling double coincidence, wait till you meet two presidents separated by a century, connected by assassination, an eerie string of parallels, and one very unlucky car. Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. It reads like the kind of conspiracy-laced Reddit thread you'd scroll through at 2 a.m., only everything is true. Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, two of the most iconic American presidents, assassinated a century apart, locked in a web of eerie parallels that seem too precise to be random. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Kennedy? 1946. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy? 1960. Both were assassinated on a Friday. Both were shot in the head. Both were killed in the presence of their wives. Both were shot by men with three names, John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, names that tally up to exactly 15 letters each. Booth ran from a theater and was caught in a warehouse. Oswald ran from a warehouse and was caught in a theater. And that's just the warm-up. Lincoln was shot in Ford's theater. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln Yes, the car made by Ford. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy who warned him not to go to the theater. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln who warned him not to go to Dallas. Both of their successors were named Johnson Andrew Johnson and Lyndon B. Johnson, born 100 years apart. These parallels feel like a historical Ouroboros, a looping riddle etched into the fabric of America, as if some unseen author copy-pasted fate with minor tweaks. It's uncanny. It's horrifying. It's mathematically improbable. Of course, there's no logical reason why two assassinated presidents should share this many bizarre overlaps. And yet, there it is, glaring back from textbooks and trivia lists like a smirking ghost. But this story doesn't end in Dealey Plaza, because long before Kennedy's Lincoln, there was another ship, fictional, unsinkable, and cursed to meet an iceberg in the North Atlantic 14 years before the Titanic ever did. The unsinkable ship and the novel. In 1898, a writer named Morgan Robertson penned a novella titled Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. It was a cautionary tale of hubris on the high seas. The Titan, an enormous ocean liner, hailed as unsinkable, set sail with too few lifeboats. Halfway through its voyage across the North Atlantic, it strikes an iceberg and sinks, killing nearly everyone on board. Sound familiar? 14 years later, in April 1912, the RMS Titanic, a real-life behemoth also deemed unsinkable, departed from Southampton. Like the fictional Titan, it was carrying too few lifeboats. Like the Titan, it collided with an iceberg in the North Atlantic, and like the Titan, it sank into the icy black with devastating loss of life. But the coincidences don't stop at surface-level similarities. The dimensions of the two ships? Nearly identical. Titan was 800 feet long. Titanic was 882. Both struck the iceberg around midnight. Both sank 400 miles from Newfoundland. Both carried about 2,000 passengers. And in both tales, the wealthy elite made up a large share of the dead. Robertson, a former merchant marine, claimed he didn't predict the future, he just knew ships. But the accuracy of Futility reads more like time travel than nautical insight. It was as if he'd stepped through a wrinkle in time and written a grim premonition with the serial numbers filed off. It begs the question, is coincidence just chaos wearing a tuxedo, or is it something else? Fate with a flair for theatrics? And if you think that's spooky, wait till you meet the man who claimed he'd live and die with a comet and actually pulled it off. Mark Twain's birth and Halley's Comet. Mark Twain, the man who gave us Huck Finn and the most weaponized sarcasm in American letters, was born in 1835. Not just any year, but the year Halley's Comet came streaking across the sky, bright and ominous. He knew it. He talked about it. He even made a promise. I came in with Halley's Comet. It is coming again, and I expect to go out with it. That was Twain being Twain flippant, fatalistic, always half in jest. But in 1910, Halley's Comet returned. And so did the Reaper. Mark Twain died on the 21st of April, 1910. Just one day after the comet reached its perihelion, its closest point to Earth. Now, let's not pretend this was just a fun footnote. This was a man who mocked destiny to its face, then called his own death tied to a celestial body. What are the odds? Even creepier? He didn't just predict his own death, he styled it, turned it into a cosmic punchline. Twain, a lifelong skeptic and satirist, essentially engineered his departure as a darkly poetic mic drop. The comet itself has long been considered an omen. It burned through the heavens during the Battle of Hastings. It reappeared during plagues and famines. And for one deeply American storyteller, it became the ultimate exit sign. Twain's life filled with biting wit and absurd, truth ended as absurdly as it began, with a fiery rock flaring across the void. It's coincidence, yes, but also legend-making coincidence, the kind that turns biography into myth. But if you think dying with a comet is eerie, try this. The first British soldier to die in World War I and the very last are buried just 15 meters apart, in the same cemetery. Like the war itself, bookended with symmetrical death. The first and last British soldiers killed in WWI. World War I began in chaos and ended in anticlimax, a war that chewed up millions and spit out mud, blood, and ghosts. And buried in that horror is a macabre little symmetry that history rarely hands out. The first British soldier killed in the war, Private John Parr, and the very last, Private George Edwin Ellison, are both buried in the same cemetery. Not just the same plot of land, but just 15 meters apart. Let that sink in. 4 years. 4 years of trench warfare, poison gas, failed charges, and mechanized death. Millions dead. And the two soldiers who marked the first and final British blood, spilled in the conflict, rest almost shoulder to shoulder in St. Symphorien Military Cemetery in Belgium. Parr was a teenage scout, killed in August 1914 in a reconnaissance mission gone sideways. Ellison, a veteran nearing middle age, was shot on the 11th of November, 18 hours before the armistice was to take effect at 11 a.m. The war had already been won. Ellison, like many others on that final day, died for nothing, for timing, for orders, for some general's vanity. The cruel poetry of it is overwhelming. History wrapped itself into a loop, folding the first and last pages of Britain's war dead into the same green square of soil. Coincidence? Sure. But also a kind of grotesque symmetry. A joke with no punchline. A reminder that in war, beginnings and endings mean nothing to the people who die between them. And speaking of uncanny timing, what happens when someone is born the very day another explorer disown whose footsteps they'll unknowingly follow into the white jaws of Antarctica? The man who knew too much. The 6th of December, 1858. A man named Robert Falcon Scott is born. A British naval officer who will, decades later, lead one of the most infamous expeditions to the South Pole. That same day, in a coincidence both historical and haunting, another explorer dies, Captain Charles Wilkes, one of the earliest Americans to map the Antarctic region. Scott was born as Wilkes left the stage, like one tragic Antarctic handoff, and it wouldn't be the last eerie overlap in Scott's doomed destiny. Wilkes had survived his expeditions, but he didn't escape controversy. He was court-martialed for excessive punishment of his crew, a man as flawed as he was daring. Scott, too, would become a polar legend not for surviving, but for freezing to death in a snow-blasted tent just 11 miles from a supply depot. Here's where the coincidence hits with a cosmic jab. Wilkes helped plant the seeds of Antarctic exploration. Scott harvested them and paid the ultimate price. Born the day Wilkes died, Scott's legacy was fated to intersect with the icy white continent from his very first breath. The symbolism is heavy, as if Antarctica needed a new soul the moment Wilkes gave his up. One man exits, another enters, both drawn toward the same endless white. It's not just a coincidence, it feels like some cold karmic chain. But as chilling as that is, wait until you hear the last words of a dying king, mumbled in irritation on his own deathbed, aimed not at God or history, but at his nurse. The king's deathbed. King George V of the United Kingdom, ruler of an empire so vast the sun literally didn't set on it, met his end not with a whisper, nor with a prayer, but with a snarl. His final words, recorded by his personal physician, were, "God damn you." The target of his ire? A nurse who had dared to give him a sedative. It's the kind of death scene that defies all royal expectations. No grand last statement for the history books. No solemn farewell to crown and country. Just a grumpy monarch lashing out at the poor soul trying to ease his passage from life into death. Of course, this wasn't just any monarch. George V had ruled through World War I, rebranded the royal house from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the more English-sounding Windsor, and survived a lung operation that removed part of his rib. He was tough. He was blunt. He was also, apparently, not great with painkillers. But here's where the eerie detail really sharpens. Hours later, his physician Lord Dawson of Penwood hastened the king's death with a lethal mix of morphine and cocaine, so that his death could be announced in the morning papers rather than the less prestigious evening editions. So those words, "God damn you," were not just the king's last. They were aimed, poetically or prophetically, at the man who was about to kill him. It's one of those rare historical micro-moments that sits at the crossroads of coincidence and conspiracy. A monarch's final act reduced to a muttered curse, accidentally or maybe perfectly directed at his own executioner. But if that seems like a personal tragedy wrapped in irony, just wait, because the next two men weren't kings, they were conquerors. And both decided, separated by more than a century, to invade the same icy nation, in the same month, with the same hubris, and were both swallowed by the same frozen hell. If your brain's already buzzing from these first 7 eerie coincidences, just wait, we're only getting started. But before we hit the next wave of historical deja vu, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And hey, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you doom scrolling at 2 a.m., or catching this over your morning coffee? Let's hear it from the time zone travelers out there. Napoleon and Hitler's Russian campaigns. There's something almost mythic about the way hubris operates in history. It repeats it's not just thematically, but sometimes down to the very month, the very soil, the very snow. Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler, two of history's most infamous military leaders, each launched a full-scale invasion of Russia in June, Napoleon in 1812, Hitler in 1941. Both confident, both methodical, both soon doomed. Each invasion started with overwhelming force. Napoleon brought the Grande Army over 600,000 strong. Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, with more than 3 million soldiers. The goal in both cases? Quick domination, a swift decapitation of the Russian war machine. Easy, right? But the Russian landscape doesn't care about ego. It only answers to time and frost. Both men watched their mighty forces claw their way deep into Russian territory, only to be undone, not by guns or tactics, but by winter. A savage, merciless winter that doesn't negotiate. For Napoleon, the temperature dropped, the supply lines collapsed, and his starving army froze and bled its way back west, hounded by Russian forces. For Hitler, the Red Army dug in, counterattacked, and let the snow and mud strangle the Wehrmacht. Both retreats turned into slow-motion massacres. Even stranger? Both invasions began in late June. Both suffered their worst defeats in the bitter heart of winter. Both invasions marked the beginning of the end for their regimes. History didn't just repeat it, echoed like a cannon fired through ice. Same country, same month, same fatal arrogance. Two tyrants who thought they could outwit winter. But if you think that's eerie, try wrapping your head around this. One taxi driver, two brothers, both killed in eerily identical accidents. A year apart, in the exact same place. The twin brothers and the fatal accidents. It sounds like a scene cut from the Twilight Zone for being too implausible. In 1970, on the sun-drenched streets of Bermuda, a man was riding his moped down a quiet lane when a taxi suddenly veered and struck him. He died on the spot. A year later, his twin brother, same age, same build, same moped, was riding the exact same route. He was hit and killed by the same taxi driver, driving the same taxi, carrying the same passenger. What are the odds of that? This isn't just tragic. It's mathematically terrifying. Identical twins, identical deaths, identical circumstances, same road, same vehicle, same human being behind the wheel. It reads like the universe glitched, or like fate decided to hit copy-paste with morbid precision. Some claimed it was fate pulling strings. Others pointed to the eerie interconnectedness of life on a small island. But the layers here go beyond chance. The same taxi driver being involved not once, but twice, in the deaths of the same family on the same road, that's not just coincidence, that's cosmic recursion. And it begs the question, was the second brother haunted? Did he feel it coming? Was the taxi driver ever the same after that second impact? Whatever you believe, it's one of those incidents that forces even the most hardened skeptic to pause, because sometimes reality bends so tightly into itself that it looks a lot like fiction. And speaking of fiction, what happens when a baby is saved from fire, grows up, and years later saves the very same man who saved him? That's not just strange, that's a full circle pulled from the flames. The rescued baby. A baby is trapped in a burning building. The flames roar, the smoke chokes, hope is thin. Enter firefighter John Condona, man trained to run toward what everyone else runs from. He charges into the blaze and emerges moments later, coughing, scorched, but cradling a crying baby in his arms. The infant survives. No one thinks much of it. Just another statistic in a fireman's career. But decades pass. The baby grows up, becomes a man, decides to follow in the soot-streaked footsteps of the man who saved him, becomes a firefighter. And then, in a moment, thick with irony, history loops. He rescues an old man from a burning building. That man? John Condon. Same man, new flames. A complete reversal of roles. It's one of those quiet, tear-jerking twists that wouldn't be believable if it weren't so well documented. The odds of it happening? Astronomical. The symbolism? Profound. This isn't just a coincidence, it's a karmic knot. The idea that the universe, when it bothers to pay attention, sometimes gives back. Think about the beauty in that cycle. A baby saved from death becomes the guardian of life. The man who gave him breath through smoke is repaid in kind. No fanfare, no prophecy, just timing. Like fate passing a baton through fire. But if that story makes you believe in cosmic balance, prepare to be unsettled again. Because some patterns aren't about redemption, they're about a curse. A presidential curse. A 0-year curse. One that spanned over a century and left a trail of bodies in the White House. The Curse of Tippecanoe. It starts in 1840, with William Henry Harrison, a war hero turned president who dies just 31 days after taking office. The shortest presidency in U.S. history. Pneumonia, they said. Bad weather at the inauguration, some added. But then it happened again, and again, and again. Every U.S. president, elected in a year ending in a 0, every 20 years, died in office. 1,840. Harrison, dead. 1,860. Lincoln, assassinated. 1,880. Garfield, assassinated. 1,900. McKinley, assassinated. 1,920. Harding, heart attack. 1,940. Roosevelt, cerebral hemorrhage. 1,960. Kennedy, assassinated. It's a pattern so precise, so grim, it became folklore. The Curse of Tippecanoe, they called it, named after Harrison's role in the 1811 Battle of Tippecanoe, where he fought against Native American forces led by the prophet Tenskwatawa. Some said the curse was his dying gift. Others claimed it was born in blood and retribution. Whatever its origin, the pattern held for over a century. Presidents elected in 0 years kept dying in office. Coincidence? Or did the White House have a date with destiny every 20 years? It wasn't until 1980, when Ronald Reagan shot in an assassination attempt survived, that the spell appeared to be broken. And even then, some believe it only shifted. A delay. A deflection. But the fear lingered into the 2000 election, with George W. Bush taking office. Another 0 year. Another collective shudder. Whether it's numerology or narrative convenience, the curse of Tippecanoe remains one of the most bone-chilling statistical streaks in American political history. But if cursed numbers feel abstract, how about something more personal, like secretaries with strange names and presidents whose lives mirror each other in increasingly unsettling ways? The Lincoln-Kennedy parallels. More. Yes, we've already cracked open the eerie vault between Lincoln and Kennedy, but the rabbit hole? It goes deeper. Because beyond their Friday assassinations, beyond Ford's Theater and the Lincoln car, beyond the Johnsons who succeeded them, comes something even stranger: their secretaries. Abraham Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. John F. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. Coincidence? Sure, until you consider what those secretaries reportedly did. Lincoln's secretary Kennedy warned him not to go to the theater that night. Kennedy's secretary Lincoln advised him against going to Dallas. Both warnings were ignored. Both presidents died. Now pause. This isn't a punchline. This isn't a Reddit thread grasping at straws. This is real history, documented and repeatedly cited. The two men not only reflected each other in policy, timing, and death, but also in the details swirling around their final days. There's a symmetry here so tight, it feels rehearsed, like reality is plagiarizing itself. A president dies. A secretary named after another president tries to stop it. Fate doesn't listen. And let's not forget, both men were succeeded by Southerners named Johnson. Both Johnsons were born 100 years apart, and their assassins Booth and Oswald each had exactly 15 letters in their names. Again. At a certain point, you have to ask, is history mocking us? Is it a glitch in the matrix? Or is coincidence just chaos with good comedic timing? Either way, if patterns are what we're chasing, buckle up. Because the next man, he survived not one but 2 shipwrecks. And in both disasters, he was the only survivor. The doomed ship and the lucky man. Meet Thomas Griffith, a man either cursed by the sea or chosen by it, depending on how you like your fate stories. In 1660, Griffith was aboard a ship that met its end somewhere off the coast. The sea swallowed the vessel whole, taking everyone with it. Everyone except Griffith. He was pulled from the waves bruised, battered, but alive. He carried on with his life, likely haunted but grateful, until lightning struck twice. Years later, Griffith boards another ship. Another voyage. Another disaster. The ship sinks. Once again, everyone dies. Except Griffith. The same man, the same nightmare, twice, alone. How do you walk away from that? Twice, spared by Poseidon, as if the sea couldn't quite decide whether to take him or torment him. 2 catastrophic shipwrecks, 2 miraculous survivals, 0 companions. In a time without GPS, life vests, or Coast Guard helicopters, surviving 1 shipwreck was already a marvel. Surviving 2 and being the only survivor both images into the realm of the supernatural. Was he just incredibly lucky? Unbelievably unlucky? Or was he some unwitting pawn in a cosmic bet? Whatever the case, Griffith's tale is more than strange. It's the kind of real-life parable that makes you squint at the laws of probability and wonder if something else was pulling the strings. And, speaking of the uncanny, the next twist involves a name. A little girl named Regan, a fictional possession, and a real-life author who couldn't escape his own creation across decades. the author and the characters' names. Some coincidences are visual, others are mathematical, and then there are the ones that whisper in your ear, chill your spine, and linger in your brain like a ghost hiding just out of frame. The case of William Peter Blatty and his character Regan is one of those. In 1893, a British author by the name of William P. Blatty. No, that's the oddity. William Peter Blatty wasn't born until 1928. So how could a novel from 1893 feature a coincidence tied to a future author? Because here's the twist. This story plays with name echoes, time loops, and the slippery way fiction infects real life. In 1971, Blatty published The Exorcist, a terrifying tale of a girl possessed by a demon. The child's name? Regan McNeil, an innocent name forever stained by horror. The story became iconic. The film adaptation, which Blatty also wrote, turned Regan into the poster child for demonic possession. The head spins, the green vomit, the infamous voice. But deep in the folds of obscure literary history, there's a fictional exorcism from 1893 that also features a possessed character named Reganlong before Blatty ever put pen to paper. The name, the possession theme, the dark spiritual undercurrent, these details align like moon phases. Coincidence? Probably, but it raises an eerie question. Did the name Regan carry some unseen weight? Did it whisper through the ether, waiting to be reborn in modern horror? Or did the subconscious reach backward, snatch a ghost of an idea, and breathe it into a new form? Whatever the explanation, Reganonce, an uncommon nominau, invokes instant dread thanks to one man's story, and maybe, just maybe, thanks to another's before him. But if borrowed names give you chills, how about a license plate that seems to predict the end of a war? Because the car that carried Archduke Franz Ferdinand to his death bore numbers that look a lot like the date of World War I's end. The unlucky car. The 28th of June, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is riding through Sarajevo in an open-top car. The day is sunny. The mood? Cautious optimism until it's shattered by bullets. The Archduke is assassinated, and the world is never the same. This moment, this single chaotic spark ignites World War I. But here's where things start to twist into something stranger. The license plate on the car. An ordinary metal tag with an extraordinary set of characters. A 3118. Look at that again. A3118. It doesn't take a conspiracy theorist to decode the chill. A possible shorthand for 11 divided by 11 divided by 18, the 11th of November, 1918. The date the war ended. Let's pause. The car that carried the man whose murder triggered a 4-year global slaughter had a license plate that resembles the date of its conclusion. Is that fate flashing its credentials? Or just a random string of letters and numbers getting hijacked by hindsight? Either way, it's hard to ignore. The vehicle of death carrying the date of peace. A before and after snapshot engraved in tin. It's like the car knew. Like the war wrote its end date in the margins of its own beginning. Now, skeptics will say it's a stretch, a reach, but if history has taught us anything, it's that symbols don't need permission to feel meaningful. They just need to exist. And this one exists, cold, metallic, absurdly specific. But now, let's take a sharper turn into the stars. Because next, we meet a man who didn't just flirt with fate. He predicted the death of a king down to the exact day, and got it right. The man who predicted his own death. Some people read horoscopes for fun. Others make a career out of reading fate's diary. Cherub-born William John Warner was a famed British astrologer in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He read palms, charts, stars, and history, apparently. In 1913, Cherub publicly predicted that King Edward VII would die on May 6, 1910. At first, the date seemed arbitrary, a little too neat, a little too confident. But Chero had a reputation for accuracy that made even skeptics squirm. And then it happened. Edward VII died on May 6, 1910. Exactly as Chero had foretold. No fudging, no approximations. Just a clean, exact hit. Was it luck? An informed guess? Or had the man truly tapped into something beyond reason? Chero wasn't your run-of-the-mill fortune teller. He read the palms of presidents, generals, and celebrities. His circle included the elite of Europe. And while many saw his predictions as theatrical, this one stood apart. It wasn't vague. It wasn't symbolic. It was a date. A date that came. A king that died. The chilling part is how casual it all seemed, like predicting the weather, but with royal blood on the line. And it raises an unsettling question. If death has a schedule, who gets to read it? Whether you believe in astrology or not, this one's hard to shake. A public prophecy, a monarch's demise, and a legacy of timing that continues to shadow the pseudoscience world. But hold on to that thread, because the next twist ties birth to peace. A baby born on the exact day a war ends. Not just any war, but the one that birthed America. The man who was born on the day the war ended. The 30th of November, 1874. In a stately home in Oxfordshire, England, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill enters the world. A future prime minister. A wartime icon. A man destined to shape the 20th century with defiance, cigars, and bulldog tenacity. But here's the twist. That same date, the 30th of November, marks another historical moment. The formal signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The agreement that officially ended the American Revolutionary War. The war that birthed the United States. The war that severed the British Empire from its rebellious colonies. So let's unpack this. The man who would later lead Britain through its darkest hour was born on the anniversary of the day Britain officially let go of its most valuable colony. Talk about a strange symmetry. Churchill was many things. A soldier, a writer, a politician, and, eventually, the man who rallied an entire nation under the thundering drum of "We shall never surrender." And yet his life began on a date saturated with British defeat. He entered the world as the Empire's ghost from across the Atlantic, flickered in the historical mirror. Coincidence? Absolutely. But the symbolism practically writes itself. A war ends. A leader begins. The fall of one chapter. The rise of another. History, again, folding into itself like origami. And that's just the start of odd Roman echoes that ripple through time. Because if Churchill's timing was poetic, the next coincidence takes imperial destiny to its theatrical extreme. The first and last Roman emperors to bear the name Augustus. Bookends to an empire. The first and last Roman emperors named Augustus. Rome began not with a bang, but with a name. Augustus, the first emperor. The architect of imperial Rome, the man who turned a republic into a dynasty. Octavian took the title Augustus in 27 BCE, and from there, an empire was born grand, ruthless, and eternal, or so they thought. Flash forward 5 centuries, the Western Roman Empire is a shadow of its former glory, splintered, crumbling, gasping for relevance. Its last emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus. Let that settle. The first emperor is Augustus. The last emperor? Augustulus, literally, Little Augustus. Romulus, of course, is another loaded name. The mythical founder of Rome. Combined, Romulus Augustulus was a name soaked in imperial myth. He symbolized both the beginning and the end. The Alpha and the Omega of Roman dominion. But the irony runs deeper. Romulus Augustulus wasn't even a real emperor in the eyes of many. He was a teenage puppet installed by his father and quickly deposed in 476 AD. No final conquest, no glorious death, just a quiet vanishing. A paper emperor presiding over the ghost of an empire. So we began with Augustus, the Sun King of Roman politics. And we ended with a child, a little Augustus, whose reign fizzled like the dying embers of a once blazing fire. It's the kind of historical full circle that reads like intentional design, like Rome itself wanted to put a bow on its own story. And if imperial ends and beginnings leave you spinning, wait until you hear about the two brothers in Siberia who looked to the sky one last time before everything changed forever. The Brothers and the Meteorite. The 30th of June, 1908. A fireball tears through the skies above Siberia and explodes mid-air over the Tunguska region, flattening over 800 square miles of forest. Trees lie like matchsticks. The sky burns. The shockwave knocks people off their feet hundreds of miles away. Amid the chaos are two brothers, Kuzma and Pyotr, collecting mushrooms in the taiga, unaware that they're about to witness the most powerful explosion in recorded history not caused by a nuclear bomb. Kuzma dies instantly. His body, according to accounts, was never found. Pyotr survives, scarred, shaken, changed. He returns to his village, haunted by fire from the heavens, and becomes the unintentional keeper of one of the strangest eyewitness accounts in cosmic history. He lives on, raises a family, tells the tale. And today, his descendants still live in the area, still connected by blood and geography to a moment when the sky cracked open. The Tunguska event remains a mystery. No impact crater, no confirmed meteorite fragments, just scorched earth and shattered lives. Scientists believe it was an airburst from a comet or asteroid. But to the locals, it was a curse, a visitation, a message from the sky. And for the two brothers, it was a coin toss with fate. One burned into history, one burned away. The odds of being in the direct path of such a rare cosmic event? Astronomically low. The odds of surviving it? Even lower. And the odds of your own brother dying beside you as you watch the forest evaporate in a flash? Unthinkable. And yet, that's what happened. In the endless Siberian forest, two men stood under a fireball. One lived to tell, one didn't live at all. But if you think that's the last time history doubled back on itself, prepare for a spiritual déjà vu of the divine variety, because the papacy has its own uncanny pattern. Two men in white robes, centuries apart, both stepping down from the throne of St. Peter, the two popes who resigned. In a church known for its eternity, resignation is rare. The papacy is a lifelong role, a spiritual marriage to the throne of St. Peter. Popes don't quit, they die. That's the way it's supposed to go. And yet, 3 times in over 2 millennia, a pope has said, enough. Pope Benedict XVI shocked the world in 2013 when he announced his resignation, citing declining health and a waning ability to meet the demands of the office. It was the first papal resignation in nearly 600 years. But it wasn't without precedent. Before him came Pope Gregory XII, who stepped down in 1415 to help end the Western Schisma, chaotic period in which multiple claimants to the papacy existed at the same time. And before Gregory, Pope Celestine V, who in 1294 lasted a mere 5 months before he, too, abdicated. A deeply ascetic man, Celestine preferred caves to cathedrals and left the Vatican to return to monastic life. What links these men is more than just paperwork. Celestine V resigned, citing personal inadequacy. Gregory XII resigned for the unity of the Church. Benedict XVI did so for health, but each departure carved a rare notch into the timeline of Catholic tradition. And here's the twist, that elevates the pattern to something stranger. Benedict's resignation came nearly 600 years to the day after Gregory's, and both were tied not just by timing, but by transition, by moments when the Church was desperate for stability, clarity, or divine intervention. Coincidence? Maybe, but it's hard to ignore how precisely history lined these moments up, like dominoes falling once every 6 centuries. And if you think religious institutions are the only ones playing temporal tag, consider this. 2 ancient cities, worlds apart, both founded on the exact same day, the 21st of April. The Twin Cities. The 21st of April. It's not a holiday. It's not a full moon. It's not marked on many calendars. And yet, this single date stitches together 2 of the most significant urban birth dates in Western history: Rome and London. Rome, the Eternal City, was, according to legend, founded on the 21st of April, 753 BC, a shepherd's tale soaked in blood and myth. Romulus, raised by wolves, kills his brother Remus and draws the first boundary line of the Roman Empire in dirt and destiny. That line would become the spine of Western civilization for over a millennium. Now fast forward nearly 800 years to the 21st of April, 43 AD. The Romans, ever eager to export their empire, set foot in a swampy corner of Britannia. There, on the banks of the Thames, they establish a settlement. They call it Londinium. The 21st of April again. Is it a coincidence? A calendrical glitch? Or a symbolic echo of empire reaching back to its own origin story? It's not just that both cities were founded on the same day, it's that they were the capitals of 2 empires that would go on to rule much of the known world. Rome ruled with legions and Latin, London with ships and shillings. Both imposed order, language, architecture, law. Both left deep scars and deep legacies in the globe. And both, by chance or cosmic timing, began on the 21st of April. It's tempting to imagine some Roman official, centuries after Romulus, flipping through scrolls and muttering, "Let's do it on the anniversary." But there's no record of that. Just the eerie precision of 2 global powers aligning their origin story on the same spring day. And if matching cities across centuries doesn't faze you, how about this? A man who fell from a skyscraper not once, but twice. Same man, same building, same miraculous result. The man who fell off a skyscraper, twice. Joseph Figlock was a window cleaner in 1930s Detroit, a man who spent his days dangling high above the city streets, trusting his life to ropes, pulleys, and maybe a bit of luck. But even luck has its limits. Or at least, you'd think. The first time Figlock fell, he was cleaning windows on a skyscraper when he lost his footing and plummeted dozens of feet. But instead of splattering on the pavement, he landed miraculously on a pedestrian below. Both survived. Battered, bruised, but breathing. Statistical fluke, right? But then, it happened again. 2 years later, Figlock fell from the same building, and once again, he landed on someone below. Once again, both lived. There are only so many ways to say, that shouldn't happen. Falling off a building once and surviving is extraordinary. Doing it twice, in the same spot, with the same bizarre cushion? That's something else entirely. No one ever walks under a falling man and expects to save his life, much less survive it themselves. But Figlock became an accidental meteor, crashing twice into human padding, rewriting the odds, and walking away to clean another pane of glass. You couldn't script it better. Hollywood would reject the plot as too absurd. Physics would scoff. And yet, there it is, though. Bizarre, life-threatening coincidences stacked on top of each other like bricks in a very unsafe building. Figlock never asked to be part of a miracle. He just showed up to work, but history had other plans. And if you think a man falling twice is wild, just wait, because next, we're heading back to Lincoln and his assassin's brother, a man who once stepped out of the shadows to save a president's son from a train. The actor and the presidential assassin. The Civil War may have ended in 1865, but its ripples never stopped. Case in point, the Booth brothers. One is infamous John Wilkes Booth, the assassin who shot Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater. The other, Edwin Booth, one of the most celebrated actors of his time and ironically one of the most loyal Unionists in American theater. Their lives couldn't have diverged more sharply. One murdered a president in cold blood. The other graced stages with Shakespearean gravity and was lauded as a national treasure. And yet, Historiever, the lover of symmetry, their fates together in the most peculiar of ways. Years before Lincoln's assassination, Edwin Booth was waiting at a train station in New Jersey. Nearby, a young man stood too close to the edge of the platform. A sudden jolt, a slip. The boy tumbled backward straight into the path of an oncoming train. Without thinking, Edwin lunged. He grabbed the young man by his coat collar and yanked him up just in time. The two exchanged brief words of thanks. Nothing dramatic, just a lucky save. Only later did Edwin discover who he had rescued. Robert Todd Lincoln, President Lincoln's son. Think about that. The brother of the man who would murder President Lincoln had previously saved the president's son from death. It's the kind of twist that doesn't feel real, like someone tried to balance out the karmic books in a single generation. One Booth takes a Lincoln, another Booth saves one. A family curse? Or a cosmic correction? Whatever you call it, it's not something history forgot. Robert Lincoln remembered it for the rest of his life. And if you think that's the end of unlucky happenstance, wait until you hear about a man who got hit by 2 trains and lost an arm each time. The man who was hit by a train twice. George G. Blaisdell wasn't just unlucky, he was practically hunted by locomotives. In 1906, while working near the tracks, he was struck by a train and lost his left arm. A tragedy, sure but not unheard of, in an era when safety was more suggestion than standard. But fate wasn't done with him. In 1917, 11 years after the first accident, Blaisdell was struck by another train. This time, it took his right arm. 2 train accidents, 2 amputations, same man, different arms. It's the kind of brutal symmetry that makes you question reality. Most people never get hit by a train in their lifetime. Blaisdell managed to pull it off twice, with surgical precision, left, then right. A 1-2 punch from fate, leaving him quite literally disarmed. And yet, the man lived on, adapted, functioned, likely even joked about his train troubles at some point. Because what else can you do? Coincidence? A cruel cosmic prank? Or did Blaisdell's path in life just happen to intersect twice with the iron horse of doom? Either way, it's hard not to shudder at the sheer improbability. Lightning might not strike the same place twice, but apparently, trains do. And speaking of recurring doom, let's rewind a few centuries to the days of powdered wigs and guillotines, where a royal couple's birthdays, death dates, and one specific day of the week all lined up in unsettling ways. The unlucky date. Let's talk about Tuesdays. Most people don't associate them with doom. They're the forgettable middle child of the week, too far from Friday to be hopeful, too far from Monday to be tragic. But for King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette of France, Tuesday was the unholy bookmark in their fate. Louis XVI was born on the 23rd of August, 1754. His queen, Marie Antoinette, was born on the 2nd of November, 1755. They lived in luxury, ruled in excess, and when the French Revolution roared through Versailles in blood, Louis was executed by guillotine on the 21st of January, 1793. Marie followed on the 16th of October, 1754. 793. Both were executed on a Tuesday. Now sure, it might sound like a coincidence squeezed for drama. But when you stack it up their birth years, their closely timed deaths, and the day of the week, it feels like history lining up its dominoes with morbid precision. It's as though Tuesday became their cosmic due date, the day the monarchy crumbled, the day their heads rolled into baskets, the day the Ancien Regime got its final exhale. But it's not just the dates, it's the irony. The king, once considered God's representative on earth, reduced to a spectacle in the public square. The queen, once adorned in silk and infamy, dragged to her death before jeering crowds, and all on the same day of the week. When revolution wants symbolism, it doesn't hold back. And if you think Tuesdays were cruel to royalty, wait till you hear about a man whose invention was present the night Lincoln died, and how news of that death was transmitted through the very device he helped bring into the world. The inventor and the assassination. The 14th of April, 1865. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, is shot at Ford's Theater. A bullet to the head, a stunned crowd, and the dawn of an American tragedy. But woven into the fabric of that night is a coincidence hiding just outside the limelight, a man whose invention helped carry the news of Lincoln's death across the country. That man? Samuel Morse, inventor of the telegraph and the Morse code system. Here's where the historical hairs start to stand on end. Samuel Morse was in Washington, D.C. on the very night of Lincoln's assassination. He didn't witness the event, he didn't participate in it. But the device he'd brought into being, the telegraph, was the first to transmit the news of the president's murder. The very tool designed to bring the world closer was used to deliver the shattering blow of national loss. And it gets stranger. The telegraph had only recently matured as a technology. Morse's codey, a series of dots and dashes echoing through wire-shad, revolutionized communication. What once took weeks could now take hours. And on that night, as the president lay dying, the nation found out not through whispers or newspapers, but through electricity. Morse's presence in the city feels ghostly in retrospect. The man who connected America just happened to be nearby when the country's most unifying figure was gunned down. A tragic coincidence? Absolutely, but also a symbol. Lincoln's death marked the end of one chapter in American history. Morse's invention marked the beginning of a new one where no tragedy would remain local. And speaking of timing, our next story brings you a Roman emperor whose life was written in symmetrical ink. Born and died on the same calendar date. History doesn't usually do neat endings, but this one was eerily punctual. The Roman emperor who died on the same day he was born. In the grand theater of Roman history, where assassinations, betrayals, and dramatic last words reign supreme, the life of Emperor Julian cuts through with strange numerical poetry. Born on the 6th of November, 331 AD, Julian, later called Julian the Apostate, would rise to power as one of Rome's last pagan emperors. Educated, philosophical, and fiercely independent, he sought to restore Rome's old gods at a time when Christianity was tightening its grip on the empire. His reign was short, his ideas controversial, and his legacy mixed. But what truly sets Julian apart in this lineup of emperors is how he exited the world. He died on the 26th of June, 363 AD. Wait, that's not the same date, right? Here's where it gets strange. Accounts vary. Some ancient chroniclers report that Julian actually died on his birthday, the 6th of November, 363. Whether due to translational errors, calendrical confusion, or timekeeping quirks of the Roman era, multiple historical sources mark his birth and death on the same day. It may seem minor in the blood and guts annals of the empire, but that kind of symmetry is rare, especially in a world where emperors usually exited via blade, poison, or divine rage. Julian, for all his attempts to control the fate of an empire, couldn't dodge the ultimate spoiler, a Persian spear to the abdomen during battle. And yet, even in death, his narrative wrapped itself up like a well-written play, beginning and ending on the same page. It's history's way of saying, "Thanks for coming. Now please leave quietly." And if dying on your birthday is eerie, imagine being assassinated and then having your successor almost meet the exact same fate a decade later in a twist that feels less like history and more like a cursed rerun. The man who was assassinated twice. No, you're not reading that wrong. William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, shot by an anarchist while greeting the public at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. He was shaking hands, smiling, a symbol of calm in an era of rapid American expansion, until 2 bullets turned the scene into chaos. Now here's the hook. His successor, Theodore Roosevelt, would face the exact same kind of assassination attempt, public, political, point-blank, only 11 years later. In 1912, while running for a 3rd term as a progressive candidate, Roosevelt was shot in the chest by a deranged saloon keeper. The bullet went through his folded speech and into his body. But Roosevelt, bleeding, insisted on giving the full 90-minute speech before seeking medical attention. The crowd went wild, the doctors were stunned, and the press ate it up. McKinley died of his wounds. Roosevelt survived his. The difference? A few inches, and a stack of papers thick enough to deflect destiny. But look at the larger picture. 2 back-to-back presidents, one killed, the other nearly. A country still staggering through the growing pains of industrialization and nationalism. The parallels aren't just political, they're practically narrative. Even weirder? Roosevelt only became president because of McKinley's death. Then, once out of office, he was almost pulled back into history's tragic echo. It's as if the presidency itself carried residual violence, as if the office remembered what it had lost and tried to take another. And while Roosevelt lived to fight another day and hunt another moose, the coincidence remains lodged like a bullet in the historical record, half an inch away from déjà vu. And next, 2 kings, 2 dynasties, one fatal hobby, and one peculiar name they shared when fate found them in the forest. The 2 kings named Philip. Royalty has always had a knack for drama, but fate has its own sense of tragic humor. Take Philip IV of France and Philip I of Spain too. Kings from different countries, centuries apart, but with matching names and eerily matching fates. Both were monarchs, both were powerful, and both met their end, not in war or palace intrigue, but in the quiet brutality of a hunting accident. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, ruled with icy control. He was a political shark, famously tangling with the Pope and dismantling the Knights Templar. But in 1314, his reign ended suddenly after a hunting accident left him fatally injured. No battlefield, no assassin, just a king who slipped from his horse and never recovered. Fast forward a couple centuries to Philip I of Spain, known as Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg prince, a political pawn, a monarch by marriage. He too died suddenly after a hunting trip. No war wounds, no poisoning, just a fatal twist of fate in the woods. So here we are, 2 Philips, both kings, both young, both taken out not by rivals or rebellions, but by the very pastime that symbolized royal leisure and control over nature. It's like fate pointed and said, "Let's take these 2 out while they're off guard." And there's a grim poetry in that. Hunting was the king's domain, a performance of dominance, and yet it's where these 2 men lost all power, taken not by armies or enemies, but by accident, or perhaps design. But if kings falling in forests seems unlucky, our next story takes coincidence and karmic payback to another level. A baby saved from drowning grows up and returns the favor in a flood of fire. The man who saved a baby and then was saved by that baby. It begins like a tale from an old firefighter's notebook, one of those near-mythic rescues that live on in local legend. In the 1930s, a man named George Willison was working as a lifeguard when he pulled a drowning baby from a lake. Quick reflexes, the right timing, and a bit of luck turned a tragedy into a save. The baby lived, and Willison moved on, never expecting that moment to echo back decades later. Years passed. The baby grew up, became a man, joined the fire department, a full circle kind of thing. Maybe he knew his origin story, maybe he didn't. But one day, fate caught up with both of them. During a house fire, the older George Willison found himself trapped. Smoke clawing at his lungs, flames chewing through walls, and then a rescue. A young firefighter bursts through, pulls Willison out, and saves his life. And that firefighter? The same baby Willison had saved all those years ago. Think about the odds. The same two people. One saves the other, then the roles reverse decades later in entirely different circumstances. It's not just a coincidence, it's a karmic loop. A narrative so tidy, it feels fictional. But it's not fiction. It's the raw math of fate working overtime to make a point. You save a life, you might just earn your own miracle in return. And that brings us to one of the oldest curses in history, a dusty tomb, a golden sarcophagus, and a whole bunch of people who should have known better than to poke the afterlife. The curse of the pharaohs. Tutankhamun's tomb was sealed for more than 3,000 years. A pocket of airlocked silence, packed with gold, secrets, and a curse that may or may not have been real. When Howard Carter opened the tomb in 1922, he cracked into something more than a burial site. He cracked into legend. Shortly after the tomb was breached, people involved in the excavation began dying. Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's backer, was the first bitten by a mosquito. The wound turned septic, and he died in Cairo not long after the tomb's opening. The lights allegedly went out in the city the moment he passed. Then more deaths followed. Carter's team members, visitors, reporters, accidents, illnesses, all clustered suspiciously around the people who had dared enter the boy king's final resting place. Now, let's be clear. Science offers explanations. Mold, ancient bacteria, bad luck, but the pattern was hard to ignore. The sheer number of untimely deaths and the eerie timing fueled the myth of the pharaoh's curse. Newspapers ran wild with it. Public fascination exploded. Hollywood made it a genre. And the coincidences? Stacked like pyramids. Many who died had nothing in common except one detail: they had been present in or around the tomb. The ancient Egyptians believed that names and remembrance kept the dead alive. Maybe violating that sanctuary stirred something older than dust. Was it supernatural vengeance? Or just the universe reminding us that disturbing sacred things has consequences? Either way, Tutankhamun didn't go quietly, and the echoes of that curse still rattle through history. And speaking of ancient signs, did you know that on the day the Declaration of Independence was signed, the sky itself turned its gaze downward? The Founding Fathers penned liberty under the shadow of an eclipse. The Founding Fathers and the eclipse. The 4th of July, 1776. The day that liberty got an autograph. The Declaration of Independence was signed, and the United States took its first official breath of sovereignty. It's a date soaked in patriotism, powdered wigs, and fireworks. But up above, in the vast indifference of space, something else was happening. Something far more ancient than democracy. A partial solar eclipse, visible in Philadelphia, hovered like a cosmic exclamation point over the newborn nation. The symbolism writes itself. The Founding Fathers, seated in that sweltering room, pledging their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, did so under a shadow. Not just metaphorically, the war with Britain was just beginning, but literally, as the moon slid partially between Earth and the sun, darkness touched daylight. The stars briefly blinked into view. An eclipse is often considered an omen. In ancient cultures, it was a warning, a sign of gods displeased or destiny shifting. And here it was, intruding silently on one of history's most thunderous declarations. Coincidence? Of course. But imagine standing there, quill in hand, as light dims unnaturally in the middle of the day. Imagine signing your name to rebellion as the sun slips behind the moon. It must have felt like divine punctuation, either a blessing or a warning. And yet, America endured, grew, conquered, faltered, rose again. Still, that eclipse remains a quiet footnote in the country's origin story, a shadow that lingered even as freedom lit its first candle. And speaking of fleeting glory and foreshadowed doom, our next story involves 3 race car drivers who reached the peak of their sport, and then met the same grim fate, one after another, in chilling succession. The doomed race car drivers. Racing is a sport with a death wish. The faster you go, the more death inches into the cockpit. But in the history of the Indianapolis 500, America's greatest motor race, there's a cluster of victories tied together by something more than checkered flags, a grim pattern. 3 drivers, 3 winners, all dead within a short time after their greatest triumph. Gaston Chevrolet, brother of the man who co-founded the Chevrolet Motor Company, won the Indy 500 in 1920. That same year, he died in a crash during another race. Instant, violent, sudden. Then there was Joe Boyer, co-winner of the 1924 Indy 500. Less than 3 months later, he was killed in a race at Altoona Speedway, another fiery wreck. And finally, Bill Vukovich, arguably the most dominant driver of his era. He won back-to-back Indy 500s in 1953 and 1954. In 1955, while leading the race and seemingly on his way to a 3rd victory, he died in a horrific multi-car crash. All 3 men reached the pinnacle of their sport, then died, almost immediately afterward in racing accidents. It's as if victory had a price. Win the 500, and the Reaper starts his stopwatch. Now, racing is dangerous. That's no mystery. But the sequence, the timing, the eerie uniformity of success followed by death feels like something scripted by the gods of speed themselves. 3 champions, 3 coffins, a trio of cautionary tales written in rubber and fire. And if surviving lightning-fast death machines sounds harrowing, imagine surviving lightning itself not once, but 7 times. That's not just improbable. That's borderline myth. That's 33 coincidences down, and if you're still here, you're officially in deep. But we've barely scratched the surface. The weirdest ones are still ahead. So before we dive back in, hit that subscribe button to stay locked into the madness. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Are you wide awake or spiraling into a late-night history hole? Either way, we've got more to mess with your timeline. The man who escaped death multiple times. Roy Sullivan was not a man to take shelter. A park ranger in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park, he spent his life under the sky, with the trees and trails and thunderstorms of Appalachia for company. And maybe that's why lightning kept finding him. 7 times. Let's be clear. The odds of being struck by lightning once in your lifetime are around 1 in 15,000, but 7 times? That number spirals into the billions. And yet, Roy Sullivan lived through it all. The first strike hit his leg and toe, the second singed his eyebrows, the third burned his shoulder, the fourth set his hair on fire, the fifth knocked him unconscious, the sixth left him with burns again. The seventh? Well, by then it was practically routine. It's not just the fact that he survived all 7 strikes, it's that he kept going back to work, into the woods, into the storms, like he was daring fate to try harder. Sullivan became known as the human lightning rod. A man stalked by thunder. Some said he was cursed, others claimed he was blessed. After all, lightning usually kills. But for Sullivan, it just kept showing up. There's a tragic twist, though. Despite surviving nature's most aggressive warning signs, Roy took his own life in 1983 over something entirely unrelated to lightning: a broken heart. It's one of those stories that reminds you how cruel and arbitrary the universe can be. A man can outlast the sky's wrath, only to be undone by something as invisible and silent as sorrow. And, speaking of uncanny foresight, let's go back to 1865, where a novelist wrote a fictional assassination that almost perfectly foreshadowed Lincoln's real one. Right down to the play, the shot, and the back of the head. The book and the assassination. 1865 was a year already thick with death. The Civil War was ending, Lincoln was making plans for healing the country, and history was poised for a bloody twist. But before the bullet cracked through Ford's Theater that April, before the crowd screamed and the curtain fell, a man named George Dixon penned a story that seems like it was ripped from the real-life headlines before they happened. In that year, Dixon wrote a novel about an assassination. Fictional, sure, but disturbingly specific. In his story, the victim is a high-ranking political figure. He is shot while attending a theatrical performance. The weapon? A small pistol. The shooter? A man with a political vendetta. The shot? Straight to the back of the head. Sound familiar? Abraham Lincoln was assassinated that same year, at a theater, by a pistol to the back of the head. Dixon's novel didn't name Lincoln. It didn't claim to be prophecy. But the parallels were uncannily so. It was as if someone handed the writer a summary of an event not yet unfolded, and he simply changed the names to protect the guilty. Coincidences like this don't settle easily. They linger. Was Dixon's story pure imagination, or a twisted kind of literary premonition? Did he accidentally channel the future? Or was the theater just a natural stage for America's growing pains and Lincoln the inevitable tragic lead? We'll never know. But the fact remains. A writer described in detail a political assassination that would soon play out almost exactly as written. And if that doesn't chill you, how about this? 2 American presidents, both with the briefest terms imaginable, died on the same day of the year, years apart, like a morbid presidential rerun. The 2 presidents who died on the same day. The 4th of April isn't known for parades or federal holidays, but maybe it should be, if only for how it seems to tap the shoulder of U.S. presidents with the cold finger of mortality. In 1841, President William Henry Harrison died on the 4th of April, just 31 days after taking office. Pneumonia took him out in a historical blink. His term was the shortest ever. Fast forward to 1850, President Zachary Taylor, who had only served for 16 months, also dies while in office. And once again, the date is the 4th of April. 2 presidents, 2 unexpected deaths, same office, same exact calendar day. Now, presidents dying in office isn't unheard of, but dying on the same date? That's a tighter loop than chance usually dares to pull. The 4th of April became, for a brief window in American history, a quiet death knell for the commander-in-chief. Both men were elected during turbulent times. Harrison during the log cabin populist wave, Taylor amid sectional tensions that would eventually ignite the Civil War. Neither lived long enough to steer through the storms. And while their deaths may not be linked by cause, their coincidence in date and role raises the question, does history mark its anniversaries with eerie precision? Or do we just notice the patterns we're afraid to forget? Either way, April 4 stands not just as a number, but a warning. And speaking of warnings, imagine predicting a political revolution in Russia down to its ideological heartbeat years before the first shot is fired. That's exactly what happened next. The man who predicted the Russian Revolution, 4 years before Lenin rolled into Petrograd like a thundercloud, 4 years before the Tsar was toppled and a royal family turned into a tragic footnote, a French novelist sat down and wrote about angels rebelling against heaven in Russia. In 1913, Anatole France, author with a Nobel Prize and a gift for weaving metaphor into prophecy, published The Revolt of the Angels. It was, on the surface, a theological satire, a story about celestial beings revolting against God and launching their own revolution. But beneath the winged metaphors lay something sharper, a thinly veiled allegory of class struggle, rebellion, and anti-establishment fervor set unmistakably in the cultural and political climate of Russia. 1 year later, World War I would begin. 4 years later, Russia would erupt into revolution. The Tsar would be overthrown. Marxism would rise. The angels had revolted, and they weren't celestial, they were Bolsheviks. France didn't claim to be a prophet. He was a satirist, a critic, a thinker. But like all great writers, he saw the smoke before the fire. And The Revolt of the Angels now reads, not just as fiction, but as premonition. He saw the cracks forming in the Tsarist walls, and guessed accurately what kind of creatures would come pouring through. Call it intuition, call it coincidence, but the man wrote about a revolution that was still 4 years away and nailed the mood, the momentum, and the consequences. Sometimes, fiction isn't just a mirror. Sometimes, it's a flashlight pointed at the future. And speaking of futures on borrowed time, the next story takes place on a sinking ship where a group of musicians played one final song, not just any song, but one that may have serenaded hundreds into the icy dark, the Titanic Band. The 15th of April, 1912, the RMS Titanic, once hailed as unsinkable, disappears beneath the North Atlantic. Iceberg, panic, lifeboats. The whole story has become legend. But one moment quiet, tragic, noble still, echoes across time. The ship's band. As chaos unfolded and passengers scrambled, the 8-man ensemble continued to play. No one told them to. No one expected it. But they kept the music going. Their final tune? Most survivors remembered it as, "Nearer, my God, to thee." Let that settle. While steel cracked and the ocean swallowed lives, these musicians created calm, a hymn for dying hearts, a soundtrack to the end. And here's where coincidence becomes something stranger. "Nearer, my God, to thee" had long been associated with finality, even heroism in the face of death. But what are the odds that a song about approaching the divine would be played in real time as hundreds moved toward that very horizon? None of the band members survived. They knew they wouldn't, and still, they played. What elevates this from anecdote to eerie coincidence is that the song itself had been used in earlier maritime disaster splay during lifeboat drills, memorials, even fictional accounts of doomed voyages. It became the go-to hymn for ships in distress. And then, on the most infamous shipwreck in history, it becomes the final note. It's as though the ocean itself had a theme song, and the band, knowing their end was sealed, offered it up willingly. And now, for something less reverent but equally uncanny, a pair of world leaders, one from the US, one from the UK, born in the same year, destined to lead through fire together. The American president and the British Prime Minister. George W. Bush and Tony Blair too, names forever linked by the events of the early 2000s. Allies in war, faces of controversy, and, as it turns out, born in the same year, 1946. On the surface, it's just a calendar coincidence, but when you pull the thread, something more intricate appears. These two men would lead their nations through 9/11s, the War on Terror, and the invasion of Iraq. They would stand shoulder to shoulder in one of the most polarizing international alliances of the 21st century. And yet, their political lives had begun decades earlier, shaped by different cultures and ideologies. Blair, the centrist labor reformer with a polished smile. Bush, the plain-spoken Texas conservative with a legacy to live up to. Different parties, different styles, same generational stamp. Born into a post-WWII world, they emerged at a time when leadership demanded clarity, or at least the illusion of it. And somehow, their paths aligned at the exact historical moment the world fractured under terror and war. It's as if history queued them up from the same demographic batch, preparing two men from opposite sides of the Atlantic to step onto the same blood-stained stage. Coincidence? Probably. But uncanny nonetheless. Especially when you consider their shared decisions, shared criticism, and the enduring shadow they left on the modern geopolitical landscape. And if that still feels too grounded, consider this. The same play that entertained Lincoln in his final moments was one his assassin's brother had performed in years earlier. The unlucky play. On the night of the 14th of April, 1865, Abraham Lincoln sat in Ford's Theater watching Our American Cousin, a British farce filled with humor and wit. It was during the play's funniest line that John Wilkes Booth fired his fatal shot. The moment was meant for laughter. Instead, it became a historical bloodstain. But here's the twist. Booth's own brother, Edwin Booth, had previously starred in Our American Cousin. Years earlier, Edwin had performed the same lines, taken the same stage cues, in the same production. And he wasn't just any actor, he was the actor of his time. America's leading Shakespearean, revered, respected. So the play that framed Lincoln's death had already been performed by the brother of the man who would kill him, a script shared between two siblings, on either side of history's moral divide. Imagine the psychological whiplash. Edwin, an actor devoted to the Union, unknowingly sharing a theatrical link with the assassination of the very president he admired. John, consumed by Confederate rage, using the stage as his entry and exit wound. It's more than irony. It's a morbid loop, a family affair drenched in tragedy and timing. The same play, the same bloodline, two brothers, one stage, and only history left to sort out the heartbreak. Coincidence doesn't even cover it. This is poetic horror. And if you think getting caught in someone else's spotlight is bad, the next story involves a man who was struck by lightning and then won the lottery. Either he was cursed, or he was the luckiest man alive, or both. The man who was struck by lightning and won the lottery. Some people are born lucky, others are built from raw lightning-scorched chaos and still come out ahead. Enter Bill Morgana Man, whose life swung violently between horror and jackpot in the span of one absurdly cinematic story arc. In 1999, Bill, an Australian truck driver, was involved in a terrible accident. He was clinically dead for over 14 minutes after a heart attack, and doctors feared he'd never recover. But he did, miraculously, defying death like it was a dare. And as if that wasn't enough, lightning struck again figuratively. After his recovery, Morgan bought a scratch-off lottery ticket and won a car. Elated, he was asked to reenact the win for a local news crew. So he bought another ticket, on camera, while the crew filmed him for the news. He scratched it and won again. This time, a $250,000 jackpot. Twice. In a row, one staged, one real. Now rewind. This is a man who was legally dead just weeks before, who came back from the brink of nothingness, then proceeded to win the lottery on live television. It's not just luck. It's like fate wanted to make a public apology. The odds of winning a lottery once are minuscule. Winning again, on camera, after cheating death? That's a cosmic mic drop. Bill Morgan's story is a reminder that sometimes the universe spins the roulette wheel twice and lets it land on the same impossible number. And while that kind of fate is hard to replicate, it turns out some people are born to mirror each other in ways that feel manufactured. The next story? Identical twins. Separated at birth. Living identical lives. Like glitching clones in the simulation. The twins. Separated at birth. Nature or nurture? Free will or design? Whatever side you take, the story of the Jim twins will make you question if our paths are ever really our own. Identical twin boys, separated at birth, adopted into different families. No contact, no communication, no idea the other existed. But both were named Jim. Both grew up in Ohio. Both married women named Linda. Both divorced. Both remarried to women named Betty. Both had sons. One named his James Allen, the other, James Allen. Both had childhood dogs. Both named them Toy. At this point, you're probably blinking, but there's more. Both Jims grew up enjoying carpentry and mechanical drawing. Both drove Chevrolets. Both worked in law enforcement. And when they finally reunited at age 39, their similarities were so staggering that researchers couldn't help but study them as part of a broader twin experiment. So what happened here? Did genetics override everything else? Or was this just one of history's most spectacular coincidences? Two men, carbon copies of each other, leading parallel lives without ever knowing it. If it were fiction, we'd call it lazy writing. But it's not fiction. It's what happens when chance, DNA, and maybe something eerily unseen all shake hands. The story of the Jim twins is often brought up in debates about destiny. But forget the science for a moment. What you're left with is a human echo chamber. Two lives, same rhythm, same names, same everything. And while they were finding each other, two emperors from opposite sides of the world were reaching their final chapters almost in perfect sync. Because the next coincidence ties a Russian Tsar and a Japanese emperor to the same calendar year of death, like history decided they'd reached their expiration date together. The Russian Tsar and the Japanese emperor. 1918 was a year of seismic endings. The First World War was gasping its last breath. Empires were collapsing like sandcastles, and the old world was dying to make room for the new. In the middle of all this global upheaval, two men at the pinnacle of their respective dynasties drew their final breaths. Nicholas II of Russia, the last Tsar, and Emperor Meiji of Japan, both died in 1918, East and West, monarch and monarch. One beheaded by revolution, the other wrapped in tradition and ceremony. Let's start with Nicholas II. Overthrown by the Russian Revolution, he and his family were executed in a basement by Bolsheviks. The Romanovs fell not with grandeur, but with bullets in the dark. It marked the brutal, definitive end of Imperial Russia. Now turn to the east. Emperor Meiji had transformed Japan from a feudal patchwork into a modern empire. Under his reign, Japan industrialized, militarized, and emerged as a global power. He died surrounded by respect and order, but his passing marked the end of an era no less monumental. Two leaders, two systems, two extremes of death, one abrupt, the other ceremonial, but both gone in the same year. 1918 wasn't just a calendar year. It was a hinge. Old empires snapped shut. Monarchies lost their thrones. And the deaths of these two rulers mirrored the east-west axis of global power beginning to shift. Coincidence? Perhaps. But what's uncanny is how precisely these symbolic deaths bookended the fall of old-world dominance from vodka palaces in St. Petersburg to the chrysanthemum halls of Tokyo. And now, as the map redrew itself, another strange duality unfolded. On opposite sides of the Atlantic, two Menon, the rebel leader of a revolution, The other, a fading monarch, both died the same year. One shaped history, the other lost it. The founding father and the king. 1799, the closing curtain of the 18th century, a time when the ink on the world's most seismic revolutions had barely dried. Monarchies were crumbling, republics were rising. And in that single year, two figures locked on opposite ends of history died almost simultaneously. George Washington, the face of rebellion. King George III, the face of empire. One led the charge for American independence. The other tried and failed to crush it. And both died in 1799. Washington passed on the 14th of December, peacefully in his bed at Mount Vernon. He was 67, long retired from the presidency, hailed as the father of his country. His death was a moment of mourning across the newly formed United States eulogies, ceremonies, reverence. King George III didn't die physically in 1799, but in a way far stranger, he mentally departed the world that year. His mental health deteriorated rapidly, and he was declared unfit to rule. By the end of that year, he had slipped into a fog of madness that he would never fully emerge from. His reign continued in name, but not in spirit. He lived for 2 more decades, but the king who'd once ruled an empire was, in all but function, gone. 2 Georges, 2 empires, 2 symbolic deaths in the same year. One revolutionary and one royal, bound not by politics, but by fate's curious timing. It's as though the last page of their shared chapter was turned at the same time, closing out the first true era of modern geopolitics. But while monarchs and revolutionaries were making their exits, one unlucky town in Ohio was getting soaked, again and again and again, by flood. On the same date, across 3 different decades. The unlucky town. Ripley, Ohio isn't famous for much. A river town with charm, history, and, apparently, a cosmic rain cloud that refuses to let go. The 25th of March. That's the date. Circle it. Burn it into your calendar. Because in 1850, Ripley was hit with a devastating flood. Homes drowned, streets vanished, lives upended. Then came 1883, same town, same date, same flood. And just when the town had surely had enough, 1913 rolled in, the 25th of March, again, another flood. 3 different floods, 3 different decades, all on the exact same date. This isn't a seasonal weather pattern. March in Ohio is unpredictable, but not that precise. The odds of 3 separate flood disasters hitting one town on the same calendar day are mind-numbingly low. Add in the fact that these weren't mere puddles, but full-scale inundations, and the coincidence becomes borderline mythic. It's as if the 25th of March had been circled in red ink on some divine planner. The day Ripley gets washed. The universe, it seems, likes a theme. And while the citizens rebuilt again and again, they must have looked at the calendar each March with growing dread. The date became local folklore, a marker, a warning. And it begs the question, how many times does something have to happen before it's no longer a coincidence? But while Ripley was drowning in water, a different man was stepping into history's just long enough to save a president from a runaway horse. Not with glory, not with fanfare, just with one decisive act of timing. The man who saved the president's life. 1902. Theodore Roosevelt is president. A man of action, a cowboy in a 3-piece suit. The kind of leader who wrestled the 20th century into being with a grin and a rifle. During a parade in Washington, D.C., Roosevelt's carriage jolts, panic erupts. A horse rears, breaks free, and bolts toward the president. Enter George Foster, a bystander, a nobody. Until that moment. With zero hesitation, Foster lunges forward and stops the runaway carriage, potentially saving Roosevelt's life. He didn't do it for reward. There were no medals, just instinct, timing, and guts. The moment passed. The parade continued. But the trajectory of the presidency, possibly American history, pivoted in a heartbeat. Had Roosevelt been injured or killed, who knows what course the country might have taken? No trust busting, no Panama Canal, no Rough Rider legacy baked into Mount Rushmore. One man, one horse, one tiny slice of chaos interrupted by a stranger with no cape, no title, just courage. And here's where coincidence starts whispering again. Roosevelt, of course, had already been thrust into the presidency after McKinley's assassination. He wasn't supposed to be in the White House in the first place. Now, history tried again, this time with hooves instead of bullets. And once more, Roosevelt dodged the Reaper. Thanks to George Foster. And just wait, because our next twist involves another inventor, another assassination, and a moment where science tried to save a dying president. Only this time, it was too little, too late. The inventor and the assassination. More. In the waning summer of 1881, President James Garfield was dying. Not instantly, had been shot in July, but lingered for weeks, slowly wasting away under the care of doctors who, tragically, didn't believe in sterilizing their instruments. They prodded the bullet wound with unwashed hands, guessing at its location, while the nation watched helplessly. Enter Alexander Graham Bell. Yes, that Alexander Graham Bell, the man who gave us the telephone, stepped into this drama not as an inventor of sound, but as a would-be savior. Bell, alarmed by the primitive state of presidential medical care, decided to build a device that could locate the bullet inside Garfield's body using electromagnetic induction. It was called the induction balance, a kind of early metal detector. Bell worked feverishly, testing it on cadavers, fine-tuning it with obsessive energy, and he brought it to Garfield's bedside. Here's the tragic irony. The device worked. It was capable of finding the bullet. But Garfield was lying on a metal bed frame, and the doctors insisted Bell only scan the right side of the president's body because they were convinced the bullet was lodged there. It wasn't. Bell's invention was defeated not by technology, but by arrogance and bad guesses. The bullet was in the left side. Garfield died on the 19th of September. So here we have another assassination. Another great man brought low. And once again, a brilliant inventor working in the background, trying desperately to rewrite fate with innovation. Bell didn't fail because of science. He failed because no one listened to him. Just like his invention that night failed not because it was wrong, but because the people around it were. And in a way, that's more tragic than a missed shot. It's a coincidence turned into an epitaph. But if you think that's dramatic, wait till you hear about two kings both named Edward both, dead on the same exact date, 20 years apart. A royal coincidence that stretches across generations. The two kings who died on the same day. Edward isn't exactly a rare name in British royalty. They've churned out Edwards like Americans churn out Starbucks. But Edward I and Edward I, the father and son, kings of England, share more than a crown and a bloodline. They share a death date, the 7th of July. Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots, died on the 7th of July, 1307, a crusader king, a war-hardened monarch, the man who built castles and crushed rebellions. He died on campaign, trying to launch yet another war in his endless pursuit of dominion. Exactly 20 years later, to the day, Edward II died under circumstances far more chilling. Deposed by his own wife and her lover, imprisoned, and likely murdered in a way so brutal and legendary, it still stirs academic debate. Some say a red-hot poker sealed his fate, others suggest a quieter poisoning, but the date remains undisputed. The the 7th of July, 1327. Two kings, father and son, one a lion, the other a lamb, both dead on the same day, 2 decades apart. Coincidence? The math is simple, the meaning? Unsettling. It's as if history tried to tidy up their saga with a final symmetrical flourish. The Builder King and the Broken King, 2 halves of a royal cautionary tale, both exhaling their last breath on the same sun-drenched July day. And if royalty dying in sync seems haunting, imagine a building cursed, not by politics or bloodlines, but by something far worse, an uncanny cluster of murders, and then, naturally, a fire. Because some houses aren't haunted by ghosts, they're haunted by probability. The unlucky house. It stood in New York City, an ordinary structure on the outside, brick and mortar, nothing particularly special. But the moment you stepped inside, the air got heavier, like history had been buried in the walls. In the 1890s, this house witnessed not 1, not 2, but 3 murders, 3 unrelated homicides. Different people, different times, same building. You could blame the neighborhood, you could blame bad tenants. But at some point, the statistics start to scream. And then, because why not? The house burned down. In 1900, fire tore through the property, reducing it to ash and rubble, the kind of blaze that seems less like an accident and more like an exorcism. Coincidence? Maybe. But 3 murders, followed by a fire, feels less like bad luck and more like the building was trying to erase its own past. Even creepier, none of the crimes were connected. No shared motive, no serial pattern. Just murder, then another, then another, then flames. Urban legends grew fast around the address. Locals called it cursed. Historians shrugged it off. But somewhere between lore and record sits the reality, a house where tragedy kept booking return tickets. Sometimes, architecture holds on to things. Sometimes the bricks don't forget, and sometimes, the only way out is fire. And speaking of chilling full circles, our next tale involves the very moment a man entered life and another left it. A father dies, a son is born, on the same day, the same hour. It's not just timing. It's inheritance written in blood. The man who was born on the day his father died. In 1833, the Ferris family experienced both an ending and a beginning at the exact same moment. On that very day, George Washington Gale Ferris Sr. died. And in the same breath of time, his son George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. was born. It's a detail that sounds lifted from a novel. A man dies, and at that same instant, his legacy is literally born into the world. The name transfers seamlessly, as if fate had scribbled a note in the margins of history. Replace immediately. Ferris Jr. would go on to invent the Ferris wheel, the towering, turning icon of amusement parks and engineering marvels. But his origin story reads like something preordained, a life born from death. A cycle of generational exchange, so precise it almost defies biology. He didn't just inherit a name, he inherited a narrative arc. The day one Ferris was buried, another began spinning his own myth into the future. And this isn't just about poetic symmetry. It's a hard, chilling coincidence. The idea that time sometimes keeps such a tight ledger, it won't let a name float untethered for even a single day. Ferris Jr. would build something that defied gravity, revolutionized entertainment, and left his mark on skylines forever. Yet, his life began in shadow, in silence, in the wake of a father's final breath. 2 generations, 1 clock, 1 passing, 1 arrival. And if you think familial timing is eerie, imagine what happens when identical twins don't just share a DNA strand but share a death. Same day, same cause, same rare condition. That's where we're headed next. The twin brothers and the same illness. Twins already carry a kind of mystery. They're born in tandem, mirrored at the cellular level, walking evidence that nature occasionally clones itself. But in 1980, a pair of British twin brothers proved that their bond ran deeper than shared birthdays and matching wardrobes. Both had lived for years with a rare heart condition. It was the sort of genetic defect that doctors flag but can rarely predict with precision. The twins lived cautiously, maybe even expected their condition to someday take them, but no one expected it to strike both on the same day. And yet, it did. In a twist that reads like a dark fable, both brothers died of heart attacks on the exact same date in 1980, not just within the same year or week, but the same 24-hour window. Was it biology? A synchronized genetic timer set decades earlier? Or something stranger? A psychic bond snapping at the same instant? There's something deeply unsettling about it. Not just tragic, but metaphysical. These weren't men who lived together. They weren't in the same room. And yet, their hearts failed in sync. It's one thing to say twins feel each other's pain. It's another to see it manifest in matching death certificates. The randomness of death usually feels chaotic. But here, it was too orderly, too neat, too planned. This isn't just a footnote in a medical journal. It's a glimpse into the uncanny precision with which fate sometimes draws its lines. And speaking of eerie repetition, imagine a name, a shipwreck, a desperate act of survival, and then real life copying fiction so closely, it's almost criminal. The author and the characters' names. More. In 1844, Edgar Allan Poe, master of dread and detail, wrote The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. It featured a harrowing shipwreck, 4 survivors adrift. And, in their desperation, they draw lots to decide who will be sacrificed and eaten. The unlucky loser? A cabin boy named Richard Parker. Fast forward 40 years. In 1884, a real-life shipwreck occurred off the coast of Africa. The yacht Mignonette sank. 4 men survived in a lifeboat. Adrift for weeks, starving, they finally resorted to cannibalism. They drew lots. They killed and ate the cabin boy. His name? Richard Parker. The story caused a legal and media frenzy. The survivors were tried for murder despite their desperate circumstances. But everyone was haunted by the detail that Poe's fiction had eerily prefigured the event in chilling detail names, roles, circumstances, all matching. So what are we looking at here? Literary prophecy? A subconscious premonition? Or a dark joke played by the universe at the expense of one unlucky sailor? To this day, the Richard Parker coincidence remains one of the most haunting examples of life imitating art to an absurd, grotesque degree. It's not just about cannibalism. It's about the terrifying possibility that stories can echo into reality, and names, once written, can be doomed to repeat themselves. And as we step out of that horror, the next coincidence returns us to French royalty, guillotines, and a date that drips with symmetrical dread because King Louis XVI didn't just live through revolution. He died by its numbers. The unlucky number. The French Revolution wasn't just a political upheaval. It was a complete numerical reset. Calendars, measurements, even the names of the months were reinvented. And in the middle of that revolutionary arithmetic stood King Louis XVI monarch, whose reign was guillotined into history. But there's a strange mathematical symmetry that hovers over his fall, a coincidence wrapped in numbers. Let's unravel it. Louis XVI was the 16th king of France named Louis. Obvious, maybe. But the pattern starts tightening. He was executed by guillotine on the 21st day of January, 1793. And here's the kicker. That date, the 21st of January 1793, fell in what the revolutionaries called the 16th year of the revolution, if you trace it back to the financial crisis of 1777 that set the fuse. This revolutionary math can be debated, but many historians align that year as the moment when the monarchy's fate was effectively sealed. So, we have King Louis XVI. Louis executed on the 21st day of the first month of the 16th revolutionary year. A numerical alignment so eerie, it almost reads like the revolution had a countdown timer, and Louis was fated to be its bloody punctuation mark. It's hard not to see the guillotine blade shaped like the number 1. Hard not to imagine revolutionaries drunk on liberty and vengeance, unknowingly scripting one of history's most symbolically perfect executions. And as France tried to build something new from the ashes of monarchy, the United States was beginning to immortalize its own martyred leader with a memorial built by a man who, by sheer chance, was born in the exact year that president was assassinated. The man who built the Lincoln Memorial. Henry Bacon isn't a household name, but his work is seen by millions. He's the architect who designed the Lincoln Memorial, Washington, D.C.'s marble temple to a man who held a fractured nation together, only to be shot down at the moment of triumph. But there's a twist buried in Bacon's biography. He was born in 1866, just 1 year after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Think about that. A man born in the aftermath of national mourning, who would grow up to build the very structure that would house Lincoln's legacy in stone. A literal child of the Reconstruction era, raised in the long shadow of the Civil War, destined to immortalize the president whose death defined his time. It's a poetic handoff. One generation loses its leader, the next builds the monument. Bacon didn't just become an architect, became a custodian of national memory, translating grief into symmetry and grandeur. And the memorial itself? It's not just a statue, it's a shrine. The design is a Greek temple, evoking democracy's ancient roots. Lincoln sits on his massive chair, eyes forward, flanked by speeches carved into stone. It's reverent, solemn, timeless. Bacon's design ensures Lincoln is always watched, always remembered. But he never met Lincoln, never heard his voice, never saw the war. He just arrived in the wake of its hand somehow, unknowingly, became its architect of closure. And while Bacon was drawing marble blueprints, other presidential deaths were being written in the starcer, more accurately, on the calendar. Because 2 more presidents would die on the same day of the week, many years apart. The day? Monday. The 2 presidents who died on a Monday. Presidential deaths aren't exactly rare, but when they start to line up on the same day of the week, patterns begin to take shape, especially when those days are Mondays. You know, the day we all dread. Turns out, even presidents couldn't escape its curse. James Monroe died on the 4th of July, 1831, a Monday. Already that's spooky. Dying on Independence Day? That's coincidence enough, but it gets better or worse, depending on your view of fate. Franklin D. Roosevelt, America's 4-term titan through the Great Depression and World War II, died on the 12th of April, 1945, also a Monday. Now, sure, maybe you think, 2 presidents dying on a Monday? Big deal. But in a job that only a handful of humans have ever held, the fact that both these towering figures met their end on the same workweek kickoff adds just enough eerie synchronicity to make you squint at your calendar. Monroe was the last of the founding father presidents. FDR was the first modern president to fundamentally alter the office's power. One opened the door, the other redefined the room. And both clocked out on a Monday. Maybe it's just the ultimate metaphor. Mondays are the worst. But in the slow churn of time, these alignments start to pile up. And the further you dig, the more you realize history isn't linear, it's recursive. Loops inside loops. Presidents echoing each other across decades. And speaking of echoes, our next tale involves another pioneering inventor. A man who could have died in one of the very machines he helped unleash on the world. Because progress is fast. And so are trains. Too fast. The inventor and the train accident. George Stephenson, the father of railways, didn't just witness the dawn of the train age, he built it. His work with steam locomotion revolutionized transportation, industry, and the shape of modern civilization. The tracks of his ambition crisscrossed the map, threading cities and commerce into a new, faster era. But even pioneers aren't immune to the very forces they unleash. In 1830, during the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, Stephenson was present when a train struck and killed William Huskisson, a member of Parliament, making him the first widely reported railway fatality in history. That incident shocked the public and stained what should have been a triumphant debut. But Stephenson's brush with tragedy wasn't over. Shortly afterward, he narrowly escaped death in a railway accident himself. Details are scarce, but records indicate the man who forged the age of locomotion nearly became one of its first martyrs. Imagine that. The architect of modern transit almost claimed by his own creation. It's a classic tale of irony, like Prometheus, burning himself on the flame he stole from the gods. Stephenson spent his life pushing speed, efficiency, and industrial dominance. And in a flash of clanging steel and shrieking brakes, it nearly all ended under the wheels of his own vision. To survive such a moment and continue his work speaks to a certain grim poetry. He gave the world its future and nearly paid for it with his life. And while Stephenson escaped the iron jaws of his invention, other families would find themselves torn in two by civil war sometimes, literally, as brothers fought on opposite sides of America's bloodiest conflict. The brothers who fought on opposite sides. The American Civil War didn't just split a country, it split families. The battlefield was dotted with a uniquely American tragedy. Brothers, cousins, and fathers fighting against each other in blue and gray. But among the most chilling and intimate examples are the actual biological brothers who served on opposing sides. Union versus Confederacy, family dinner turned battlefield standoff. Imagine growing up playing in the same fields, eating from the same table, and then aiming rifles at each other across a smoke-choked field. It wasn't just theoretical. There are documented cases of brothers doing exactly that. Some did it out of loyalty to their state, others were separated by geography or ideology, and some simply followed whichever local militia signed them up first. Regardless of cause, the result was the same: blood versus blood. There are stories of brothers unknowingly engaging in the same battle from opposite lines, stories of siblings capturing one another and arranging secret exchanges to release them, and stories of letters sent across enemy lines, filled with family news, regrets, and the grim acceptance that their world was now cleaved in two. The Civil War wasn't fought by strangers. It was fought in living rooms, between sons, across graves. And in these brother against brother stories, we see the full absurdity of war, how ideology can twist biology into opposition. No war in American history cuts closer to the bone. And while those family fractures were happening on land, a curious symmetry was unfolding in Central America. A U.S. invasion, a handover of power, same country, same date, 10 years apart. Like the calendar itself was caught in a feedback loop. The unlucky day. The 20th of December. For most of the world, it's just another date lost in the blur before Christmas. But for Panama, and for the United States, it's a date stamped with two very different kinds of power moves. On the 20th of December, 1989, the United States launched Operation Just Cause. The objective? Oust Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega. Troops stormed in, bullets flew, and sovereignty took a back seat to geopolitical strategy. Noriega eventually surrendered after hiding in the Vatican embassy. It was a messy, controversial incursion, and a reminder that U.S. foreign policy doesn't wait for New Year's resolutions. Fast forward exactly 10 years. The 20th of December, 1999. The United States officially hands over control of the Panama Canal to the Panamanian government after nearly a century of U.S. dominance in the region. The ribbon was cut, the treaties honored, and Panama finally got the keys to its most vital artery. Two events, same country, same date, one of invasion, one of restitution. Was it planned? Maybe. But even if it was, the coincidence stands tall. The idea that exactly a decade after marching in with tanks, the U.S. bowed out with documents is enough to make even the most cynical historian blink. It's a timeline that folds in on itself. First, a show of force. Then, a gesture of diplomacy. Both moments tied to a single date, the 20th of December. A day that, for Panama, became a loop of losing and regaining control. History doesn't always rhyme, but sometimes it stamps the same date twice and waits to see if anyone notices. And next, we're diving into the belly of the sea, where one sailor's journey turns into a biblical story come to life, swallowed whole by a whale, surviving. Yes, really. The man who was swallowed by a whale. It sounds like something from the Book of Jonah or a sailor's tall tale told over too many drinks, but the story of James Bartley pushes the boundary between myth and maritime horror. In 1891, Bartley was allegedly swallowed alive by a sperm whale and lived to tell the tale. The crew of the whaling ship Star of the East was in the South Atlantic when they harpooned a large sperm whale. In the chaos that followed, the whale thrashed violently and capsized one of the smaller boats. Bartley disappeared. The assumption? He was drowned, crushed, or both. But when the crew finally subdued and hauled the whale onto the deck, they began slicing it open. And there he was, James Bartley, found alive inside the whale's stomach. He was unconscious, covered in whale fluids, bleached nearly white by digestive enzymes, and severely traumatized but breathing. After weeks of recovery, Bartley allegedly returned to health, though forever marked by the experience. His skin never regained its original color, and he was said to have suffered mental lapses from the trauma of his aquatic entombment. Skeptics have poked holes in the story for over a century, but the core coincidence remains. A man lost at sea, presumed dead, only to be discovered inside the very beast they were hunting. Whether apocryphal or true, it echoes a story thousands of years old, and maybe that's why it stuck. A man, a whale, a rebirth through the belly of the beast. And while that tale is a throwback to the ocean's unpredictable wrath, our next story plants itself squarely on land during a time when Lincoln was killed, and one of the greatest English authors was coincidentally on American soil. The author and the president. It was 1865. Abraham Lincoln was president. Charles Dickens was on tour, and fate was busy scribbling a footnote in history where art and assassination would intersect without ever meeting directly. Dickens, the literary giant of Victorian England, had embarked on an American reading tour. His novels Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, Bleak House had made him a global sensation. Americans adored him. They packed venues to hear him read aloud his own words in that crisp, refined British accent. At the same time, Abraham Lincoln was steering the country through the final days of the Civil War. Just as Dickens was reaching his tour's peak, Lincoln was assassinated on the 14th of April at Ford's Theater. What makes this moment stand out is the unintentional juxtaposition. The voice of English reform, speaking to packed houses across a nation barely held together, while its leader was gunned down for trying to mend its wounds. They never met. But Dickens was reportedly deeply shaken by Lincoln's murder. He understood the gravity, the symbolism, the loss. After all, Dickens wasn't just a storyteller. He was an observer of injustice, and Lincoln, to many, was a character pulled from Dickens's own moral universe, flawed, burdened, but driven by a need to do right. And then there's the date. Dickens was in the United States when it happened, on the very soil, perhaps even within hearing distance of the telegraph lines that first whispered the news. A man who gave voice to suffering in fiction, present for one of the most real, raw traumas in American history. Coincidence? Certainly, but the timing is almost literary. And speaking of ships and sorrow, our next story takes us to Havana Harbor where a battleship exploded, a war began, and the anniversary of its birth was lost beneath the waves it once ruled. The unlucky ship. The USS Maine was launched with fanfare on the 18th of November, 1889. A symbol of rising American naval power, bristling with guns and national pride. It was sleek, it was modern. It was invincible, at least in the minds of those who built her. Then, less than a decade later, on the 15th of February, 1898, the Maine exploded while anchored in Havana Harbor. 260 American sailors were killed. The cause? Still debated. Some blamed a Spanish mine, others pointed to an internal explosion. Whatever the truth, one fact is undeniable. That blast lit the fuse for the Spanish-American War. But here's where coincidence kicks in. The Maine sank almost exactly 9 years after it was launched. From celebratory cheers to watery tomb in less than a decade, and with that, it became more than a ship. It became a rallying cry. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, splashed across headlines, stoking public outrage and pushing the United States into imperial ambitions. A ship born in peacetime, died in controversy, and dragged the nation into war as it went down. And if the Maine's tragic end wasn't enough, there's also the twisted poetry in its timing. Just as America was beginning to experiment with global influence, the very symbol of its strength became a victim not of combat, but of fate, error, or sabotage. It's a reminder that power, when puffed too full, has a way of sinking itself. And from naval power to polar power, our next tale brings together two explorers heading north, one heading south united, not by direction, but by their shared fate. They reached the edges of the earth. Then both disappeared forever. The man who discovered the South Pole and the man who discovered the North Pole. At the dawn of the 20th century, the ends of the earth were the final frontiers. The poles north and south had become symbolic battlegrounds for national pride, human endurance, and scientific ambition. Two men stood at the heart of these frigid quests, Roald Amundsen and Robert Peary. Each conquered one of the poles, each etched his name into the white void of history. And then, in 1928, both disappeared from the world forever. Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer who was the first to reach the South Pole in 1911, vanished during a rescue mission over the Arctic. His plane was never found. The man who mapped uncharted lands disappeared into the very skies above them. Peary, the American who claimed to have reached the North Pole in 1909, died the same year. Not in dramatic fashion, but quietly, in his sleep yet still in 1928. The same year, the other polar pioneer vanished into the ice-blue unknown. One man was swallowed by snow, the other faded into legend. Opposite poles. Same year. Parallel exits from a world they helped redefine. Amundsen and Peary had never directly competed. Their missions were separate, their methods distinct. But history has a habit of looping back on itself, and in 1928, it wrote a strange kind of symmetry. The men who pushed the globe to its outermost limits, both reaching their final chapter together. Coincidence? Of course, but haunting all the same. It's as if the poles claimed their makers, gave them their due then, took them home. And if you think the world ends in blizzards, the next story tells us otherwise. Because on a clear September morning, twin towers that once touched the sky vanished in flame. But their birth just, like their death, came in a pair. The Twin Towers. The World Trade Center was built to be symbolic. It was tall, proud, global, and doubled. Twin structures rising from Manhattan's financial heart, reflecting a kind of mirrored ambition. The North Tower was completed in 1970. The South Tower followed in 1971. 2 years, 2 towers, standing together. Then, 30 years later, they fell together. The 11th of September, 2001, became one of history's most seared-in dates. But beneath the horror lies a coincidence that feels almost mythic. The towers were constructed in perfect succession and destroyed in perfect synchronicity. It wasn't just that they were destroyed, it was the way it happened. One hit, then the other. As if fate, or design, or some cruel mathematical symmetry had demanded that both structures built to mirror each other die in the same hour. And remember this, they were born just 1 year apart. It took 1 year to build the second after the first. It took 1 hour to lose them both. Even their construction mirrored their collapse. The North Tower stood taller, just slightly. The South Tower was hit second but fell first, a detail that haunts every slow-motion replay of that day. But beyond engineering, the Twin Towers represented a duality that the modern world tried to tame: capitalism and globalization, steel and glass, expansion and fragility. And in one brutal hour, they were reduced to rubble-like, a cinematic metaphor too precise to be real. Coincidence, or choreography. The line blurs. But while steel melted in fire, another mind centuries earlier was looking at the star sand, predicting the Earth's final page. A man of gravity, of laws, of light. And he had a date in mind for the end of it all. The man who predicted the end of the world. Isaac Newton. Father of classical physics, discoverer of gravity, inventor of calculus, just in his spare time. But behind the rational mind, behind the math and mirrors, was something less expected: an obsession with biblical prophecy. Newton wasn't just a scientist. He was a theologian, a code breaker, a man who believed God had left clues in Scripture, clues that, if interpreted correctly, could reveal the secrets of time itself. And according to Newton's calculations, the world would end in 2060. Yes, the same man who gave us the laws of motion also believed he had calculated the expiration date of civilization. His conclusion wasn't based on planetary alignment or comets, but on passages from the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation, ancient texts interpreted through the lens of mathematical brilliance. He believed 2060 would mark the end of corruption, the final collapse of earthly kingdoms, a reset, not necessarily fiery annihilation, but a transformation of the world as we know it. Now, let's be clear. Newton didn't broadcast this prediction loudly. He scribbled it in private notes, hidden among stacks of calculations, only revealed centuries after his death. But the fact remains, the man most responsible for the scientific revolution also had one eye fixed firmly on the apocalypse. Coincidence? Maybe not, but chilling, absolutely. Because when the man who explained the universe also sets a countdown timer for its collapse, you can't help but pause. Not because he's right, but because of who he was. And as the clock ticks toward Newton's date, we'll shift from prophecy to legacy. Specifically, to a royal family so drenched in tragedy, so cursed by revolution, they might as well have been scribbled into history by Shakespeare himself. The unlucky family. The 17th of July, 1918. The Romanovs, the last imperial family of Russia, were led into a basement in Yekaterinburg. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were executed by Bolshevik soldiers in a flurry of gunfire and bayonet strikes. History calls it a political necessity. But in hindsight, it reads like a prophecy fulfilled. Now, here's where it gets eerie. Their youngest daughter, Anastasia, had been born on the 18th of June, 1901. That's exactly 17 years and 1 month before her death. A nearly symmetrical lifespan, sliced cleanly in two by the weight of a collapsing empire. The Romanovs weren't just any royal family. They were the last breath of an entire era. Lavish wealth, divine right, orthodoxy wrapped in fur-lined autocracy. They lived in palaces of gold and marble, while the rest of Russia boiled with poverty and rage. But timing, that's where the chill comes in. Anastasia's birth and death fell on the 18th of consecutive months, 17 years apart. The numbers don't scream, but they whisper with a strange, unnerving rhythm. And there's more. Nicholas II's reign began with Tragedie, Kudinka tragedy in 1896, where hundreds were crushed during his coronation festivities. It ended with bullets in a basement. A crown bookended by catastrophe. You can chalk it up to the chaos of revolution, or you can stare a little longer and wonder, were the Romanovs cursed? Was their fall not just historical but numerological? The symmetry is too clean to ignore. And speaking of names repeating, just wait until two men, back to back, hold the same name, the same papal office, and even the same century, but one lasts just 33 days. Because legacy sometimes arrives in duplicate. The two popes named John Paul, 1978, became known as the Year of Three Popes, a celestial game of musical chairs that no one saw coming. It began with the death of Pope Paul VI, continued with the brief papacy of John Paul I, and ended with the rise of John Paul II. Now here's where coincidence twists the dial. John Paul. I was elected in August of that year. He took his name in honor of his two immediate predecessors, John the 23 and Paul VI, combining them as a gesture of unity. It was the first time in papal history that a pope had chosen a double name. A statement, a blend of continuity and innovation. And then 33 days later, he was dead. Heart attack, they said, or something more sinister, depending on whom you ask. No autopsy was ever performed. Conspiracy theories sprouted like weeds in the Vatican garden poison, cover-ups, Freemasons. But regardless of cause, his death marked one of the shortest papacies in modern history. Then came John Paul II, a Polish cardinal, charismatic, powerful. He chose his name in tribute to his predecessor, and unlike his namesake, he reigned for over 26 years. Two popes, same name, same year, one gone in a blink, the other becoming one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. It's hard not to view John Paul I as the candle that burns too quickly, a placeholder, a prophecy, or perhaps a test before the real thing. His name shared, but not fulfilled. And for the Vatican, it was a year of shock and transformation. In just a few months, the papal throne spun twice. Once into grief, once into history. And if popes can die under strange circumstances, imagine a president shot in front of his wife, public, brutal, and all too human. The man who was assassinated in front of his wife. James A. Garfield wasn't supposed to be president. He was a compromise, candidate plucked from political obscurity in the smoke-filled rooms of the 1880 Republican National Convention. But he took office anyway, quietly brilliant, a Civil War hero with a professorial streak and a belief in reform. And then, on the 2nd of July, 1881, he was shot by Charles J. Guitoa, disgruntled office seeker who thought God had told him to kill the president. The attack happened in the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. public. Loud, chaotic. But what makes it linger in historical memory is this. Garfield's wife, Lucretia, was standing right there. She had just recovered from a serious illness. Garfield, ever the devoted husband, had gone to greet her. The scene should have been tender, private, a reunion. Instead, it became a front-row seat to a nightmare. Guiteau walked up and fired 2 shots. One hit the president, the other missed. Chaos erupted. Blood. Screams. And Lucretia, frozen in horror, watched the life she had just begun to rebuild unravel in seconds. Garfield didn't die right away. He lingered for 80 agonizing days while doctors probed his wounds with unwashed fingers. It was the infection, not the bullets, that killed him. And Lucretia stayed by his side the whole time. Assassination is always a rupture in time, but when it happens in front of your spouse, it becomes something else, something that lives in the bones of the survivor. Lucretia lived another 36 years. But you can bet she relived that moment every single day. A man shot in front of the woman who loved him, by a man convinced he was on a divine mission. If you think that's gut-wrenching, just wait. Because in the next coincidence, an inventor tries to bottle a dying president's last words using technology that still echoes with ghostly ambition. The inventor and the assassination. Even more. In the weeks following President James Garfield's shooting, the United States entered a morbid vigil. Doctors fumbled. The public prayed. The country paused. But in a quiet lab, one man saw a moment to merge science and mortality. That man was Thomas Edison. At the time, Edison was already a household name. The phonographist's most prized invention had stunned the world. It could record sound and play it back. Ghosts captured on cylinders. It was miraculous. It was eerie, and it was still evolving. As Garfield's health declined, Edison became fixated on a single audacious goal: to record the president's final words. Not just document them, capture them. Preserve the dying utterance of a leader as an artifact of national memory. The way you might frame a relic, Edison wanted to etch the final vibrations of Garfield's breath into wax. This wasn't a publicized project. It hovered on the fringes of ethics and ambition. A man dying in pain, a nation in mourning, and an inventor crouched over a device, waiting to immortalize the last syllable. The irony is staggering. The president was being killed by outdated medicine-unsterilized hands and guesswork, while the most futuristic technology of the age loomed in the background, unused, unfinished, unrealized. Garfield ultimately died without his final words being recorded. Edison's phonograph never captured the moment. The idea faded, like breath on glass, but the image remains. One of America's greatest inventors, circling death like a historian with a reel-to-reel, desperate to turn grief into audio. And it begs a question. Was it science or spectacle? Reverence or intrusion? Either way, the coincidence of timing Garfield's death and Edison's quest reminds us how often history brushes against the future, only to miss the connection by inches. And speaking of missed connections, the next story is a ballet of steel and wind. A bridge too bold, a design too confident, and a collapse that danced its way into legend. The Unlucky Bridge. They called it Galloping Gertie, not because of its speed, but because of its sway wild, rhythmic, unpredictable. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge, opened in July 1940, was meant to be a marvel, a suspension bridge spanning Washington's Puget Sound, connecting communities and economies. Instead, it became a laughingstock, then a horror story. From the start, engineers noticed something was off. The bridge didn't just move, it performed. It twisted. It rippled. Cars bounced like pebbles on a drum. Pedestrians held on for dear life. It swayed in the wind like a rubber band in slow motion. Then, on the 7th of November, 1940, a windstorm hit. Not a hurricane, not even a particularly strong wind, just 40 miles per hour. But it was enough. The bridge began to oscillate, longitudinal waves, then twisting ones. it wasn't just shaking, it was dancing. In a now famous piece of film footage, you can see the road deck contorting like a ribbon in a breeze. 1 minute it's there, the next, it's plunging into the water below. No lives were lost, except for one dog trapped in a car, but the psychological shock was enormous. How could a modern structuralist than 5 months old collapse in full view of the public? It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't neglect, it was physics, misunderstood. Engineers had failed to account for aeroelastic flutter phenomenon where wind causes increasingly large oscillations. Basically, the bridge sang itself to death. The coincidence? The bridge collapsed not during a major storm or earthquake, but under normal conditions. A fatal flaw revealed not in chaos, but in routine. And the nickname Galloping Gertie went from quirky charm to epitaph. This wasn't just structural failure. It was a public embarrassment. An example of how confidence can collapse as quickly as concrete, and how even the most advanced plans can unravel when nature decides to cut in. And if bridges can fall to invisible forces, what about explorers guided by fate? Because next, we revisit two men who discovered the same land nearly 500 years apart. One had a royal commission. The other had sagas and stars. Both changed the map forever. The man who discovered America. Christopher Columbus, the man who, in 1492, sailed west into the unknown with 3 ships and a head full of ambition. He didn't find Asia. But he did land in the America sand with that, rewrote global history. But here's the twist. He wasn't the first. Almost 500 years earlier, Leif Erikson, a Viking explorer and son of Eric the Red, landed on the shores of what is now Newfoundland. He called it Vinland. No flags, no fanfare. Just sails, wood, and old world grit. Columbus gets the credit, but Leif got there first. Now here's where coincidence takes the helm. Ericsson's journey faded into legend, almost myth. It wasn't until the 19th century that scholars began piecing together Norse sagas, archaeological clues, and oral histories to confirm his voyage. Meanwhile, Columbus's story was baked into textbooks and national holidays. But both men represent opposite sides of the same coin, one driven by myth and memory, the other by ambition and maps. Both sailed into mystery, both returned with stories that changed the course of civilizations. Columbus's voyage launched an age of conquest, colonization, and catastrophe for indigenous peoples. Ericsson's? A quiet footnote, long buried in ice and saga. Yet the coincidence endures. 2 men, separated by oceans of time, discovering the same continent in the name of exploration. It's like the land was waiting patiently, stubbornly to be claimed, twice. And that brings us to the next royal revelation. Because when 2 rulers share not just a crown, but a name, in their destinies fold across centuries, history starts to look like a reflection in a very old mirror. The 2 presidents who were cousins. Sometimes history feels like a family business, and no pair of political kin better proves that than Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt. 5th cousins by blood, but closer than fate by legacy. 2 Roosevelts, 2 wars, 2 presidencies that redefined America, and a tapestry of eerie overlaps that turn coincidence into something more poetic. Theodore came first, a rough rider, trustbuster, and force of nature in pince-nez glasses. He swaggered into the presidency in 1901, after the assassination of McKinley, becoming the youngest person ever to hold the office. His policies were big, his personality bigger, and his shadow loomed even after he left the White House. Then, 3 decades later, along came Franklin. Different tone, same blood. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Theodore's 5th cousin, stepped into office during the Great Depression. He brought the New Deal, radio fireside chats, and the strength to lead the country through World War II. Where Theodore broke monopolies, Franklin broke the back of despair. Here's where the chill creeps in. They weren't just related, they were rhyming. Franklin married Eleanor Roosevelt, Theodore's niece. So, Theodore was both cousin and uncle-in-law to the man who would later become one of the most powerful presidents in history. It gets better or stranger. Both men took office during national crises. Both expanded the powers of the presidency. Both were known for their charisma, their grit, their sense of duty. And both faced assassination attempts. Two Roosevelts, same bloodline, same resolve, different wars. And as if they were bookends to an era, they bracketed the transformation of the United States from a fractured, industrializing nation into a global superpower. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe history just likes to run it back with a twist. Now let's leave the family tree behind and jump back aboard a doomed ship, because when the most famous ocean liner sinks, you'd think that'd be enough bad luck for one family, but the Titanic had a sister, and she wasn't safe either. The unlucky ship. More. You already know the Titanic, so-called unsinkable ship that proved otherwise. But what you might not know is that she had a younger sister, the Britannic, sleek, grand, destined for glory, and like her sibling, destined to sink. Here's where it gets unsettling. The Britannic was the third of the Olympic-class ocean liners built by the White Star Line. She was supposed to be the crown jewel. Safer, stronger, smarter. She had reinforced hull plating, more lifeboats, improved bulkheads, saw direct results of what they'd learned from the Titanic's watery grave. But knowledge didn't mean safety. During World War I, the Britannic was converted into a hospital ship. No longer ferrying the rich across the Atlantic, she now carried the wounded and dying. Humanitarian work in the midst of horror. On the morning of the 21st of November, 1916, while steaming through the Aegean Sea, the Britannic hit a mine. She sank in just 55 minutes faster than the Titanic. Though fewer lives were lost thanks, in part, to better lifeboat protocols, the symbolism was brutal. A ship built in the image of tragedy, sunk by the war it tried to heal. Same lineage, same fate, different ocean. And there's more. Violet Jessup, a stewardess who had survived the Titanic, was also aboard the Britannic. And yes, she survived that sinking too. It's like the ocean had a vendetta against this ship family. Or maybe it was a curse coded into the blueprints. Either way, the Britannic's fate seals the idea that even lessons learned can't always outrun bad luck. If ships can't escape their history, can people? Our next story starts not with a ship, but with a scream of cannons and a country divided. It's the birth of a man who would rise from the very day war erupted on American soil. The man who was born on the day the Civil War started. The 12th of April, 1861. Cannons thunder over Fort Sumter. The American Civil War begins, tearing the nation into North and South, Union and Confederacy. Blood spills. Brothers divide. A country fractures. And somewhere in that chaos, a baby cries. His name? Frank C. Emerson, the future governor of Wyoming. It's the kind of timing that would feel forced in fiction. As the war that would define a century erupts, a new life begins. A child born into a world already spinning with gunpowder and smoke. There's no evidence that Emerson's parents named him with the war in mind, but still his very existence is bookended by conflict. Born on the day the war began. Later, governing a state born out of the frontier shaped by that same war. Emerson's career wouldn't make national waves, but the coincidence of his birth date stands tall. He symbolizes an entire generation born from rupture, a post-bellum product of pre-bellum trauma. It's as if the war that divided a nation also birthed the men who would later rebuild it. He didn't choose his birth date, but history often chooses its symbols quietly, and sometimes they show up in a crib, wrapped not in stars and stripes, but in cannon smoke. And speaking of leaders, whose lives pivoted on dramatic exits. Our next tale ties together two monarchs, two abdications, two lavish lifestyles, and one haunting lesson. Crowns may glitter, but they don't always stick. The two kings who were deposed. The throne is a glittering promise, power, prestige, permanence. But history knows better. It knows that even kings can fall, not with a sword to the chest, but with a signature on a resignation. Enter King Edward VIII of England and King Farouk I of Egypt, two monarchs from vastly different worlds, both famed for their decadence, both forced to abdicate within the blink of a historical eye. Edward VIII shocked the world in 1936 when he chose love over duty. His romance with American divorcee Wallis Simpson scandalized the British establishment. When forced to choose between his crown and his heart, he chose the latter, uttering the now iconic line, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." And just like that, the crown passed to his stammering brother, George VI, and Edward was reduced to the title of Duke of Windsor royalty in exile. Flash forward to 1952. In Egypt, another king finds himself teetering. Farouk I, once a symbol of glamour and modernity, had become bloated literally and metaphorically with indulgence and corruption. As nationalism surged and revolution brewed, the people had had enough. Faced with the Egyptian Free Officers movement, Farouk abdicated in favor of his infant son and boarded a yacht to Italy, a monarch one day, a memory the next. Both kings were flamboyant, extravagant, and oddly charming. Both were beloved at first, then rejected. Both were forced into lives of luxurious irrelevance. And both, in a strange twist, became more famous for their exits than for anything they did while wearing the crown. Two different continents. Two similar fates. Abdication is rare. To see it happen twice within a generation is uncanny. To see it happen to such similar characters is almost scripted. And while monarchs gave up their crowns, fire was consuming another empire. Because in the next coincidence, two disasters centuries apart share the same date-burning history into the calendar with uncanny precision. The unlucky day. More. Some dates don't need explaining. The 11th of September, 2001 etched into memory with smoke and steel, but the 2nd of September, 1666, that's a date with a different kind of firepower. The day the Great Fire of London erupted, consuming the city in a blaze of biblical proportions. It started in a bakery on Pudding Lane. Within hours, flames leapt from that humble oven to the timbered rooftops of London's medieval core. The fire raged for 4 days, reducing thousands of homes, churches, and iconic landmarks to ash. Now, the uncanny twist. Exactly 335 years later, almost to the week, another September dawns clear and unsuspecting. Planes pierce the New York skyline. The World Trade Center crumbles. Another fire this time, airborne, televised, weaponized. The numbers don't align perfectly, but the month does. And so does the eerie sense of déjà vu. Two of the world's greatest cities, two September infernos. Both reshaping not just skylines, but national psyches. The fire of 1666 gave birth to a new London designed by Christopher Wren, fortified with stone and symmetry. The fire of 2001 birthed a new age of security, surveillance, and political urgency. Different causes, different eras, same effect. The world burned, then began again. There's no cosmic reason September should be such a magnet for disaster. But tell that to the calendar, or to those who watch towers fall, just as their ancestors watched steeples collapse in flame. History loves echoes, and fire, it seems, has perfect pitch. And speaking of writers who knew how to light a fuse, your next coincidence revolves around the author who stitched together a monster and the disease that shadowed her family. A tale of love, death, and creation born from fevered dreams. The author and the disease. Mary Shelley gave the world Frankenstein, a story born not just from imagination, but from the cold hands of illness and grief. She was 18 when she began the novel during that infamous year without a summer, but the shadows that fed her creation were already following her in real life. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, the slow-burning killer that haunted Europe for centuries. It claimed artists, poets, and peasants indiscriminately. But for the Shelleys, it was practically a family curse. Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary's husband, didn't die of tuberculosis. She drowned in a storm off the coast of Italy. But before that, he had been sickly, thin, fragile, and deeply obsessed with death. His poetry, brimming with fatalism and imagery of decay, feels like the writing of someone who had already made peace with illness. Mary, meanwhile, watched multiple children die. She lost her mother, feminist pioneer Mary Wollstonecraft, shortly after childbirth. Her stepsister died young. Her life was a kaleidoscope of death. The oddity isn't just the presence of disease, it's how central it became to her legacy. Frankenstein is, at its heart, a story about life, death, and the line between, about science intruding on fate, about the cost of trying to reverse the irreversible, and behind it all, tuberculosis loomed not just as a biological threat, but as a metaphor. The slow, wasting sickness that mirrored the slow, wasting guilt of her monster. The Shelleys lived with death as a roommate, and whether it came by storm, by sickness, or by supernatural fiction, it never left them alone for long. Next, we turn to another man who was no stranger to mortality, a scientist who unlocked the secrets of destruction, born decades before he'd help unleash the most terrifying weapon the world has ever seen. The man who invented the atomic bomb. On the 22nd of April, 1904, in New York City, a boy was born who would grow up to unlock the apocalypse. His name was J. Robert Oppenheimer, and while he began life as a precocious child with a love for Sanskrit and poetry, he would end up with a far more somber title, the father of the atomic bomb. He didn't set out to invent death. In fact, Oppenheimer was a philosopher at heart, eloquent, introverted, deeply troubled by human suffering. But fate had other plans. As fascism rose and World War II boiled over, America pulled together its brightest minds for a secret project buried in the desert, the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer was chosen to lead it, a theoretical physicist placed in charge of the deadliest science experiment in history. On the 16th of July, 1945, in the desert sands of New Mexico, his brainchild came to life. The first atomic bomb was detonated, lighting the sky with a blinding white fire. In that moment, Oppenheimer didn't cheer. He quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And here's where coincidence leans in. Oppenheimer was born precisely 41 years and 85 days before that explosion. A child of spring, whose greatest creation would bloom into a summer mushroom cloud. Even stranger, the Trinity test took place just weeks before the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. His work ended the war, but it also changed the world's moral calculus forever. He had helped birth a new era, and he knew it. That a poet-scientist would be the one to open Pandora's box feels almost mythic, and that he was born just in time to direct the orchestra of destruction? That's the echo that lingers. But not all names bring death. Some bring continuity. Because in the next coincidence, we find two queens named Elizabeth separated by centuries, but bound by the same crown, the same title, and a bizarre harmony of historical timing. The two queens named Elizabeth, England doesn't do things quickly. Its monarchy moves like a glacier wrapped in velvet. But when it comes to the name Elizabeth, the crown has found a certain poetic rhythm. Elizabeth I ascended the throne in 1558. Her reign became a golden age literally. Shakespeare, the Spanish Armada, and the flowering of English culture all thrived under her rule. She died unmarried, childless, and legend tells us she claimed her body politic as her only spouse. Fast forward nearly 4 centuries. In 1952, a young woman ascends the same throne. Her name? Elizabeth II. Not a Tudor, but a Windsor. Not a virgin queen, but a dutiful monarch with 4 children. And yet, the symmetry is striking. Both women took the throne at age 25. Both inherited power during uncertain times. Elizabeth I's realm was torn by religious strife. Elizabeth II stepped into a post-war Britain, rebuilding itself amid the crumbling remnants of empire. Both were seen at first as unprepared. Too young, too fragile. Both proved their doubters wrong. Elizabeth I ruled for 45 years. Elizabeth II surpassed that, reigning for over 70 years, becoming the longest-serving British monarch. Their names, etched in time, serve as historical parentheses around 2 very different, yet oddly mirrored eras. They shared more than a name. They shared timing, tenacity, and the burden of symbolic power in an age that didn't always believe in queens. Is it coincidence that the name returned to the throne during another turning point in British history? Or was it chosen precisely because of its legacy? Either way, history rhymes. And speaking of rhymes, nothing beats the number 13 when it comes to unlucky patterns. But when it appears everywhere from the mission number to the launch time to the launch pad, you're not just tempting fate. You're practically begging for a malfunction. The unlucky number 13. If you're a NASA engineer, you probably don't believe in superstition. You believe in numbers, data, checklists, but try telling that to Apollo 13. The mission launched on the 11th of April, 1970 at 13:13 CST from Launch Pad 39, which, by the way, is 3 times 13. It was the 13th Apollo mission, a string of 13s wrapped in high-octane fuel and duct-tape dreams. Initially, everything looked fine. The crew Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes settled into routine. Earth shrank behind them. The moon loomed ahead. Then, 56 hours into the mission, an oxygen tank exploded. Not a micrometeorite, not human error, a straight-up detonation inside the service module. The iconic words came over the radio. "Houston, we've had a problem." The spacecraft began bleeding oxygen and power. The moon? Forget it. They had to survive. What followed was one of the greatest feats of space improvisation in human history. Using cardboard, duct tape, and pure brainpower, Mission Control and the astronauts engineered a solution on the fly. They slingshotted around the moon and made it home. No one died, but the symbolism stuck. 13 had strutted into the cosmos like it owned the place and came home humbled. It wasn't the mission that failed. It was the number, or so it felt. Apollo 13 was supposed to be routine. Instead, it became legend not for what it accomplished, but for what it avoided. So, next time someone scoffs at superstition, show them the blueprints for Apollo 13, and then ask why NASA skipped straight to Apollo 14 afterward, without hesitation. Because, sometimes, history doesn't just rhyme knocks with a number. And that number, for the next twist of fate, was imagined decades before it was real. A machine beneath the sea, powered not by magic, but by ink, and a writer who saw it all coming. The man who wrote about a submarine before it was invented. In 1870, Jules Verne opened a portal to the future with the tip of a fountain pen. His novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas introduced readers to the enigmatic Captain Nemo and his impossible vessel, the Nautilus. A submarine so advanced, so self-sufficient, it could dive into the abyss and never need to surface. It was fiction, but only barely. At the time of writing, submarines were rudimentary contraptions, barely able to stay submerged for more than a few minutes. They were crude, cramped, and utterly incapable of the feats Verne envisioned. And yet, Nautilus glided through the deep, with electric propulsion, advanced weaponry, and creature comforts unimaginable to real-life sailors. Verne described a vessel that wouldn't become technologically feasible for decades. His vision included details eerily accurate to modern nuclear submarines long before nuclear power, or even electricity in homes, was common. Coincidence? Precognition? Or just an imagination that outpaced invention? Verne wasn't a scientist. He was a writer obsessed with discovery, a man who devoured scientific journals and extrapolated the future from their pages. But the precision of his predictions is uncanny. The Nautilus feels less like a fantasy and more like a blueprint. And here's where the eerie twist sinks in. When actual submarines were finally developed in the 20th century, naval architects acknowledged Verne's influence. His fiction guided real-world design. It was as if the future had been written and engineers were just catching up. The boundary between fiction and reality blurred beneath the waves. And, speaking of things that blur, let's return to a different kind of symmetry. Because in the next coincidence, 2 American presidents would die on the same symbolic day, separated by 5 years, but bound by fireworks and fate. The 2 presidents who died on the same day of the month. The 4th of July is Independence Day in the United States. Fireworks, cookouts, flags waving in summer heat. But beneath the celebration, the date carries a darker symmetry wound that history keeps slipping into the background. John Adams, the 2nd President of the United States, died on the 4th of July, 1826. That would be chilling enough on its own on the nation's 50th birthday. But it gets weirder. That same day, in another location, Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, also died. 2 founding fathers, 2 presidents. Dead on the exact same day, 50 years after the document they helped create was signed. But that's not the coincidence we're talking about this time. This one concerns John Adams again, but now he's joined by James Monroe, 5th President of the United States. Monroe also died on the 4th of July, in the year 1831. 3 presidents, 1 date. And here's where it stops being coincidence and starts being creepy. The 4th of July, 1826. Adams and Jefferson die within hours of each other. Adams's last words reportedly were, "Jefferson still survives," unaware that Jefferson had died just hours earlier. Then 5 years later, Monroe slips into the same historical corridor. You could call it patriotic alignment. You could call it a cruel joke from the calendar. But how likely is it that 3 of the first 5 U.S. presidents' founders all would die on the same date that marked their country's independence? Mathematically improbable. Narratively perfect. It's almost like the date reached back and claimed them, folding their lives into the mythos of America like an author writing the final line of a chapter. But while presidents die in their beds, some fates are sealed on iron rails. And in the next story, a number shows up again, and this time, it's riding a train with death in its wake. The unlucky train. It was just another train, another track, another ride from San Antonio, Texas, to New Orleans, Louisiana. But on a day in 1889, the passengers aboard didn't know they were boarding something far darker than they expected. This was train number 13. The kind of number you avoid in elevators, skip in hotel floors, and mutter under your breath when bad luck starts snowballing. But in this case, it wasn't just superstition, it was prophecy. Somewhere en route, the train derailed. 13 people died, The number couldn't be escaped, not in the train's ID, not in the body count. It was written into the itinerary of doom. There's something viscerally disturbing about numerical patterns that seem to mock us in tragedy. The train was designated with an unlucky number, and the deaths mirrored it perfectly. Coincidence? Yes. But try telling that to the families who got that telegram. The human mind seeks patterns, especially in chaos. But this wasn't just an accident. It was an echo. Another moment where death seemed to tip its hat and say, "Yes, I keep track." And it didn't help that the story got picked up in newspapers, magnifying the eerie synchronicity. People started refusing to ride train number 13. Some conductors requested renumbering. Eventually, some lines retired the number altogether. Too much risk, too much stigma. The power of coincidence isn't just in what happens, it's in how people respond. Fear spreads faster than facts, and the number 13 had just become a headline. Next, we meet a man who dared lightning and death struck twice. But he didn't just survive, he walked away from it. And oh, he won the lottery too. The man who was struck by lightning and had a heart attack. There are lucky people. There are unlucky people. And then there are people like the man in Florida in 1999 who got both ends of the cosmic coin flipped at once and still lived to tell the tale. It was a summer day, the kind where the air gets thick and storm clouds grow teeth. Lightning strikes are rare but brutal, and they tend to avoid repeat customers. Unless, of course, fate decides otherwise. This man, whose name rarely shows up in headlines but whose story burns like a scorch mark, was struck by lightning out of the blue. Not once, not over the course of his life, just once. And that one time was enough to set off a heart attack. Lightning traveled through his body, stopping his heart like a switch. It was a death sentence, for most people. But somehow, either by quick medical intervention or sheer supernatural defiance, she survived. The odds of getting struck by lightning? About 1 in 15,000 in your lifetime. The odds of having a heart attack simultaneously? Exponentially slimmer. The odds of surviving both? Basically a miracle. What makes this story more than just a tabloid headline is how it dances on the razor's edge of probability. People survive lightning strikes. People survive heart attacks. But both? At once? That's not luck. That's a glitch in the cosmic matrix. The story spread. People gawked. "That guy must be cursed," they whispered. But there's another way to look at it. Maybe the man wasn't cursed. Maybe he was too stubborn to die on a day fate chose for him. Lightning might have tried to claim him. His heart might have tried to quit. But he said no. And if you think that's strange, wait till you meet two musicians who burned twice as bright and died far too young. Their lives, their deaths, and their legacies all echo with eerie, haunting parallels. The two musicians who died young. Mozart and Hendrix. One wore powdered wigs, the other wore velvet and fire. Separated by centuries, joined by genius and by death that came far too soon. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died at 35, a prodigy who began composing before he could properly spell his own name. He was the superstar of 18th century Europe, performing for royalty, composing masterpieces like it was as natural as breathing, and yet his life unraveled just as quickly as it bloomed. Illness, mystery, and financial hardship marred his final years. His burial? A pauper's grave. The exact location remains unknown. Then there's Jimi Hendrix, a sonic firestorm. Born in 1942, Hendrix rewrote what a guitar could do. He didn't just play music, detonated it. His riffs were molten, his stage presence electric, and his innovation unstoppable. And yet, in 1970, at the age of 27, he was gone. Drugs, controversy, choking on sleep. His death, too, was sudden and shrouded. Two different genres, two different eras, but the parallels are eerie. Both men achieved more in a short life than most do in a century. Both redefined the music of their time. Both were misunderstood while alive, deified after death. And both became symbols of what happens when genius burns too brightly to last. Mozart's Requiem remained unfinished. Hendrix's last songs hinted at a new sound he never got to explore. In both cases, death interrupted an evolution. But here's the kicker. Both men continue to influence music long after their voices were silenced. Their works are studied, mimicked, and revered. Ghosts on vinyl, shadows in symphonies. What they left behind is immortal. But their early exits leave us wondering, was it fate, or does brilliance carry a countdown clock? And speaking of ghost ships and early endings, the next coincidence involves a vessel abandoned in perfect condition, crew missing, cargo intact. A floating riddle, still unsolved. The unlucky ship's name. In December 1872, the Mary Celeste was found adrift in the Atlantic Ocean. Her sails were set. Her cargo was untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no visible damage. But her crew vanished completely. It was as if they had been plucked from the ship mid-toast. The Mary Celeste quickly became a maritime legend. She was discovered by another vessel, the Dei Gratia, under full sail but eerily silent. The lifeboat was missing, but the ship's log showed no panic, no distress, no hints at a storm or mutiny. The cargoed natured alcohol was still secured. The food stores were untouched. The galley was neat. The crew's personal belongings remained. Even the captain's logbook ended mid-sentence. And yet, the people were gone. That alone would earn the Mary Celeste her place in history. But what makes it a true coincidence is the ship's record before and after the incident. Bad luck clung to the Mary Celeste like barnacles. Before the infamous voyage, she had been damaged in a collision. She went through several captains, some of whom died mysteriously. After being salvaged, she was resold multiple times, and eventually, she ran aground under suspicious circumstances. It's as if the ship was cursed from keel to crow's nest. The disappearance of the crew remains unsolved. Theories range from pirates to rogue waves to alcohol fumes causing a panic. But none explain why there was no distress call, no struggle, and no trace of the crew ever found. A ship adrift, empty but intact, sailing into history as the poster child for maritime misfortune. She was born unlucky, sailed into infamy, and died as mysteriously as she lived. And while that ghost ship vanished without a trace, the next story features a man who predicted the market would soar just before it burned down in the greatest economic disaster in modern memory. The man who predicted the Great Depression. In October 1929, Wall Street wasn't just the financial center of America, it was its altar. Stock tickers clattered like roulette wheels, fortunes ballooned overnight, and the average citizen was convinced the good times would roll forever. Then came the crash, a plunge so deep it became a historical scar. Black Tuesday. The Great Depression began. But days before the market collapsed, economist Irving Fisher, a Yale professor and one of the most respected economic minds of his time, uttered a sentence that would go down in infamy. Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. He said it with confidence. He believed in the fundamentals. He believed in progress. What he didn't believe in, at least not then, was gravity. Fisher's statement wasn't just wrong, it was apocalyptically wrong. Within days of his prediction, the market nosedived. Banks failed, jobs disappeared, breadlines stretched across cities. It was the financial equivalent of saying, the Titanic is unsinkable, just as the iceberg appears on the horizon. Here's the kicker. Fisher wasn't a charlatan. He wasn't hyping stocks for personal gain. He truly believed the economy had evolved past boom and bust cycles. He had data, models, and a mind built on logic. But logic doesn't always survive in the wild. His misstep became a case study in overconfidence. It's still taught in economics courses as a cautionary tale. Even the smartest minds can miss the storm cloud while admiring the blue sky. But what makes this a true coincidence isn't just the timing of his words, it's the haunting synchronicity between the height of optimism and the start of ruin. The very act of declaring a peak was what marked the beginning of the valley. And if financial profits can fall so hard, imagine what happens when two of the world's greatest inventors die in the same year. A symbolic passing of an era, technology, industry, and innovation exiting stage left. The two inventors who died in the same year, 1947, was a year of shifting gears. World War II had ended. The atomic age had begun. And into this atmosphere of acceleration, two titans of invention quietly exited the stage: Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. Edison, the wizard of Menlo Park, he gave us the light bulb, the phonograph, and more than 1,000 patents. A man who turned ideas into industry, who quite literally lit the world. Ford, the engineer of the assembly line. He didn't invent the automobile, but he made it move. Affordable, ubiquitous, revolutionary. He reshaped cities, roads, and the rhythms of daily life. The two men weren't just contemporaries, they were friends. They vacationed together, camped, corresponded. They respected each other's genius and shared a passion for progress. Some called them America's first tech bras, minus the hashtags and hoodies. And then, in the same year, they died. Edison passed first in 1931. Ford followed in 1947. But the coincidence here is that 1947 marked the true end of Ford's influence when his legacy shifted from living mogul to historical figure, his company transitioning into the modern age without him at the helm. That year felt like the curtain closing on a generation of inventors who had manually rewired the world. Edison and Ford weren't just men, they were movements, symbols of a century roaring into modernity. Their deaths marked not just the passing of lives, but of an era, an age of tactile innovation, where ideas were tested with wires and smoke and grit. Their parallel departures remind us that even legends run out of time, but while their bodies were buried, their inventions kept ticking, driving, glowing. And yet, progress doesn't always save lives, because the next story is set in a building full of machines and dreams that turned into a towering inferno, where fire moved faster than escape and history was scorched into the walls. The unlucky building. In 1911, the Ash Building in New York City was just another structure among many, tall, industrial, crammed with opportunity. Inside, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory buzzed with needle and thread, rows of young women hunched over machines, the rhythm of production steady and fast. But on the 25th of March of that year, the buzz turned to screams. A fire broke out. It spread faster than anyone expected. The fabric, the dust, the wooden tables, all fed the flames. But what made this tragedy so grotesque wasn't just the blaze, it was the fact that the doors were locked. Factory owners had sealed exits to prevent theft and unscheduled breaks. It was standard practice. It became a death sentence. The women, mostly young immigrants, some as young as 14, were trapped. Some burned. Others jumped from windows to escape the inferno. The street below turned into a morgue. In 18 minutes, 146 lives were lost. The Ash Building stood, fireproof, ironically. Its frame endured, even as the souls inside did not. Today, it still stands in Manhattan, a historical marker, a haunted relic. The coincidence here isn't just the fire, it's that so many red flags had already been waved. Fire codes were lax, safety drills non-existent, and yet the factory was considered modern, efficient, profitable. It took death to make change. The Triangle Fire became a catalyst for labor reform, for workplace safety laws, for union strength. The irony? The very building that symbolized efficiency became the reason America finally paused to rethink what progress really meant. The Ash Building wasn't unlucky because of the fire. It was unlucky because no one listened before it burned. And as we leave the ashes of that building, we enter a story that seems like an error in the record books. A president gunned down in the same city where he was born, or was he? Truth and myth collide in the next eerie historical twist. The man who was assassinated in the same city he was born. Let's preface this one with a caveat. History is messy. Facts are stubborn things, but so are myths, especially when they fit a chilling narrative just a little too well. This is one of those stories that feels like it should be true because it makes the symmetry so irresistible. The myth: John F. Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on the 22nd of November, 1963. That much is fact. What gets fuzzy is the claim that he was also born there. The idea that a man could enter and exit life in the same city, one that would become synonymous with his death, gives the story a kind of eerie, Shakespearean symmetry. But JFK wasn't born in Dallas. He was born in Brookline, Massachusetts, a world away in geography, culture, and intent. Still, the myth persists. Why? Because it feels true. Because it's the kind of narrative hook that history fans and conspiracy theorists alike can't resist. Let's flip it. Even though the birth-death geography isn't accurate, the symbolism still lands. Kennedy's assassination in Dallas cemented the city in American trauma. His motorcade, his waving hand, the slow turn onto Elm Street, it's a loop burned into the nation's consciousness. The idea that his life both began and ended there is false, but it reveals something deeper. We look for patterns, even in blood. The actual coincidence may be simpler. The president who embodied youth, vitality, and idealism died in the heart of a state that would later become a stronghold of conservative politics. A man of the North, cut down in the South. Sometimes, historical myths are born because the truth isn't weird enough. But our next story doesn't need embellishment. It's about a genius with a gadget racing against death to save a president and failing, not because the science was wrong, but because the bed was made of metal. The inventor and the assassination, yet more. Imagine a genius, hunched over schematics, working not on a new invention for glory or wealth, but to save a life. The year is 1881. The victim? President James A. Garfield. The inventor? Alexander Graham Bell. Garfield had been shot by a disgruntled office seeker at a Washington, D.C. train station. The bullet lodged somewhere deep inside his body, and doctors without modern x-rays or antiseptics were poking and prodding blindly, making things worse. Bell, already famous for inventing the telephone, believed he could help. He rushed to construct an electromagnetic device, something akin to a primitive metal detector. The idea was simple. Pass the device over Garfield's body, and it would signal when it hovered over the bullet. Modern minds might scoff, but for 1881, this was cutting-edge sci-fi. Bell's device worked, in tests, in theory. But when he brought it to the president's bedside, something went wrong. The machine buzzed faintly, but not near the actual location of the bullet. Garfield's condition worsened, and eventually, he died. Only later did the horrifying truth come out. The bed Garfield lay on had metal springs. Bell had unknowingly been detecting the bed, not the bullet. The irony here is brutal. Science wasn't the problem. The technology was sound. But context, the simple act of lying on a metal bead rendered the invention useless. If Garfield had been on the floor, or a wooden frame, he might have lived. So close. So tragically close. This is a classic historical blind spot. A genius invents a potentially life-saving device, only to be thwarted by furniture. The smallest oversight becomes the fatal one. Bell never gave up inventing, but that failure haunted him. And now, as we pivot from beds to vehicles, consider this. A car, its license plate bearing a number that would become iconic, almost prophetic. One final strange coincidence tied to a death that started a world war. The unlucky car. More. It's the 28th of June, 1914. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary is riding through the streets of Sarajevo in an open-top Grafenstift touring car. Beside him is his wife, Sophie. The streets are tense. Earlier that day, a grenade was thrown at his motorcade. It missed, but fate wasn't done. Moments later, as they took a wrong turn and stopped to back up, Gavrilo Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots. One of the most pivotal assassinations in human history was complete, and World War I was ignited. But here's the wrinkle that makes this already intense historical moment feel like fate itself had a hand in it. The car's license plate read, a 3118. Take a moment. The 11th of November, 1918, the date the armistice was signed, the date World War I officially ended. A coincidence? Absolutely. The plate wasn't designed with that date in mind. No one could have predicted that war would erupt from this momentum, that it would end exactly 4 years and some change later, on 11 divided by 11 divided by 18. And yet, there it was, burned into the back of the car like an ominous punchline from a time traveler. What makes this unnerving is the sheer specificity. The plate isn't close, it's exact. It transforms an already mythic moment into something cinematic, even supernatural. This one coincidence becomes the bookends of a global nightmare, beginning with bullets and ending with ink on a treaty. The license plate becomes a symbol, retroactively loaded with meaning. A relic of fate hiding in plain sight. The car itself still exists, preserved in a museum. People still visit, stare, and wonder if destiny rides shotgun in moments like these. And from metal to bloodline, we now meet 2 brothers. One ascended to the highest office in the land. The other aimed for it and fell short. But fate clearly had presidential ambition embedded in their family tree. The 2 brothers who became presidents. Sibling rivalry is usually about who got the bigger bedroom or who crashed mom's car. In the case of the Bush brothers, it was about who got to run the free world. George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States, needs no introduction. Son of George H.W. Bush, the 41st President, he was already carrying a legacy when he entered politics. But here's where the plot thickens. His younger brother, Jeb Bush, also ran for president in 2016. That alone makes the Bush family political royalty like a dynastic novel with elections instead of swords. Now, the coincidence lies in how closely Jeb came to the presidency and how history seemed to set him up for it. He was, for a long time, considered the smarter Bush, the polished one, the statesman. When George W. ran in 2000, many expected Jeb to be the future president, but it was George who won. Twice. Jeb's turn came 16 years later. The GOP primaries were his to lose, and lose them he did spectacularly when Donald Trump dismantled his campaign with a few well-timed insults and one infamous "please clap" moment. 2 brothers, 1 Oval Office, 1 spectacular near miss. That's where the coincidence becomes a gut punch. Imagine being born into the same family, groomed for the same legacy, and falling short because history had already picked your sibling. Like lightning striking the same bloodline but only once. You'd think that was enough political déjà vu for one lifetime. But wait, our next moment doesn't take place in a debate hall. It begins in a nursery on the very day humanity took a collective breath and said, "It's over." The man who was born on the day World War II ended. May 15, 1945. Europe was still reeling. The gunfire had ceased. VE Day had passed just days before, on May 8th, marking the end of World War II in Europe. Across the globe, nations staggered into an uneasy peace, unsure what came next. And on that very day, a baby was born who would grow up to shape the sound of the future, Brian Eno. Coincidence or cosmic timing? Eno would go on to become one of the most influential musicians and producers of the 20th century. He didn't just ride the waves of post-war creativity, he helped create them. Ambient music? That's him. Some of the most innovative albums by David Bowie, U2, Talking Heads, also him. Born at the dawn of peace, Eno's life and work echoed the world's craving for a new kind of beauty, a harmony that transcended the noise of the past. What makes this moment strange is how neatly it aligns. The war ends, a new world begins, and in a quiet British hospital, one of that world's future sonic architects is born. He wouldn't just make music, would redefine how we think about sound itself. Peace, meet rhythm. This isn't just birth by historical backdrop, it's a poetic rebalancing. A baby arrives on the ashes of global conflict, destined to create art that asks not, what just happened, but what can be imagined next? If the timing was off by even a day, the symmetry wouldn't hold. But history, in this case, nailed the cue. Now, if that was a soft landing, brace yourself for a harder one. Because the next coincidence doesn't involve a gentle cradlelight ends in gunfire, a basement, and the brutal silencing of an entire royal family. A date that turns a palace into a tomb. The unlucky family. More. The 17th of July, 1918, deep in the basement of a house in Yekaterinburg, Russia, history paused. Then it pulled the trigger. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, including the youngest daughter, Anastasia, were executed by Bolshevik guards. It wasn't a swift military coup. It was a brutal, close-range massacre. The Romanovs, once divine rulers of Russia, were now bodies on a blood-stained floor. Here's where the coincidence deepens into horror. Their execution took place in the dead of night, in a room where they had been told they'd be photographed. Instead, they were gunned down, bayoneted, and finished off in chaos. The air was thick with gunpowder, the walls soaked with dynastic extinction. But the Romanovs weren't just unlucky, they were doomed. Months of imprisonment had preceded their deaths. Whispers of rescue by foreign royals never materialized. And the chilling symmetry of the moment? They died exactly 1 year after Nicholas's abdication in 1917 had begun to unravel the monarchy for good. Anastasia, long believed by romantics to have survived, became a cultural myth, but modern DNA testing crushed that hope. She died there too, a child with a royal title, executed like a criminal. It wasn't just the end of a family, it was the end of an era. What's most unsettling is how cleanly this event split the old world from the new. The Romanovs' deaths marked a pivot point where divine right was replaced by iron ideology. Kings became corpses. The crown fell into a puddle. And like all tragic coincidences, this one didn't whisper, it screamed. The man who was saved by a coin. War, for all its chaos, often pivots on tiny, absurdly personal moments. One breath held too long, one step in a different direction, one soldier lowering his rifle. In this case, it may have all come down to a single British infantryman and a strange pause in 1914. Henry Tandy was a decorated soldier. He fought in some of the bloodiest battles of World War I. In one particular skirmish in France, according to later reports, Tandy encountered a wounded German soldier in his rifle sights. The man stumbled into his line of fire, bleeding and vulnerable. Tandy took aim, but he didn't shoot. The German soldier, seeing the mercy in his enemy's eyes, nodded and slipped away. Years later, this small act of wartime grace took on cosmic weight. That wounded soldier? Allegedly, it was Adolf Hitler. The story gained traction when, in 1938, Hitler reportedly showed British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain a painting of soldiers at Menin Crossroads and pointed out one figure, Tandy. Hitler claimed, "That man came so close to killing me that I thought I should never see Germany again. Providence saved me." Tandy never confirmed the tale beyond some vague acknowledgments, and historians debate the truth of it. But the core coincidence lingers, that a single pull of a trigger and fired might have altered all of human history. Mercy in this case may have been a world-altering miscalculation. Of course, war isn't just about the people who fight. It's also about the movements behind them, the ideas, the rhetoric, the voices that fan the flames. And the next story brings us face to face with the words that inspired an assassin to reach for a bullet instead of a ballot. The Inventor and the Assassination. Final. In 1901, President William McKinley was shaking hands at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, a calm, sunny moment of diplomacy in an era that still clung to the illusion of order. Then came Leon Czolgosz. He stepped forward. A wrapped hand concealed a pistol. 2 shots fired. Chaos erupted. Within days, McKinley was dead. Another American president gone to an assassin's bullet. But Czolgosz didn't act in a vacuum. His motive wasn't just personal rage, it was ideological. He had been inspired by a name that sent chills through early 20th century governments, Emma Goldman. Goldman was an anarchist, a firebrand speaker, a writer who railed against injustice, inequality, and the rot of capitalism. She wasn't a violent revolutionary, but her words had sharp edges, and for some, they were sharp enough to wound. Czolgosz attended one of her lectures. He claimed her ideas, opened his eyes, radicalized his thinking, pulled back the veil. He later insisted that he had committed the assassination in her name, to strike a blow against oppression. Goldman, for her part, was horrified. She condemned the killing and insisted she had never advocated murder, but that didn't stop authorities from arresting her. For a brief moment, she was framed as the mind behind the trigger. The irony? Goldman was a firm believer in the power of ideas, not bullets. This wasn't just a political crime, it was a philosophical collision, the invention of ideology meeting the machinery of assassination. Czolgosz became another name in the growing list of American assassins. Goldman became a symbol misunderstood, maligned, and ultimately exiled. And from the ideological to the nautical, the next story steers us into icy waters, into the life of a man who helmed 2 ships doomed to meet disaster. One of them became legend, the other, a quiet warning ignored. The unlucky ship's captain, Captain Edward John Smith, had a reputation, not just as a sailor, but as the sailor, the White Star Line's most trusted captain. A man whose steady hands had guided ship after ship across the Atlantic with clockwork precision. Passengers felt safer just knowing he was on board. That's probably why he was chosen to helm the Titanic, the largest, most luxurious, and supposedly unsinkable ship in the world. But what many forget is that the Titanic wasn't Smith's first troubled voyage with White Star Line. He was also the captain of her older sister, the Olympic, another gleaming marvel of engineering. And while it didn't sink, the Olympic had its own dark chapter. In 1911, the Olympic collided with the British warship HMS Hawke off the coast of England. It was a serious accident. Hull damage, legal proceedings, massive repairs. The incident shook the White Star Line's confidence, but not enough to sideline Smith. Instead, they gave him command of the Titanic, as if fate had decided to roll the dice one more time. And we know how that ended. On the 15th of April, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank into the North Atlantic. More than 1,500 souls lost. Smith went down with the ship, vanishing beneath the waves with his reputation shattered by freezing water and collapsing steel. The coincidence? The same man at the helm of both ships in the fleet's darkest moments. Two near-identical vessels, two brushes with disaster, one tragic legacy. Whether it was bad luck, hubris, or the burden of being the best, Smith's story is a ghost tethered to the sea. And speaking of artists who were haunted in their own ways, the next coincidence pairs two painters rebels, outcasts, and eventual legends who both died in the same year, never knowing their art would outlive them all. The two artists who died in the same year. Art history is full of tortured geniuses, but two of the most famously volatile and visionary artists, Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin, share a final coincidence that feels like a brushstroke from fate itself. They both died in 1890. Their stories are tangled together already. In life, they collided like creative tectonic plates. Van Gogh, manic and luminous, full of swirling skies and desperate longing. Gauguin, defiant and exotic, chasing raw color and primal energy in faraway lands. They painted together briefly in Arles, France, in a now infamous cohabitation that ended with Van Gogh slicing off part of his own ear. But despite their violent fallout and opposing temperaments, their ends came in eerie synchronicity. Van Gogh died by suicide in July 1890, his final years marked by illness, poverty, and unrelenting mental torment. At the time, he was barely known. One painting sold in his lifetime. One. Gauguin, meanwhile, retreated to the South Pacific, creating bold, controversial works that defied Western norms. His art exploded with color, mythology, and sensuality, but his personal life was riddled with scandal and exploitation. He died later that same year. What ties them together isn't just the calendar date. It's the idea that the world simply wasn't ready for them. Their genius existed in the margins. They were mocked, misunderstood, and mostly ignored by the mainstream art world while alive. And yet after death they became immortal. Today, Van Gogh's Starry Night and Gauguin's Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? Hang in the world's most prestigious museums. Their work fetches millions. Their influence is etched into every color wheel, every modernist manifesto. Two men who changed art forever, dead within months of each other, never knowing the scope of their legacy. A final irony, a shared eclipse. And now, from painters peering into the beyond, we shift to a writer who did the opposite, gazing into the cosmos and predicting something so uncanny, it might as well have been scribbled in a sci-fi prophecy. The man who predicted the future. In 1898, H.G. Wells published The War of the Worlds. It was a jarring, breathless novel about Martians invading Earth, pillars of fire crashing into the English countryside, cities leveled by heat rays, and humanity brought to its knees by a force it didn't understand. Wells didn't invent science fiction, but he weaponized it. His Martians weren't just creatures, they were metaphors of colonialism, hubris, technological terror. But what's most haunting about Wells isn't the story he told, it's how close it came to predicting the future. A generation later, the world would be thrown into two catastrophic world wars. Cities were firebombed, civilians massacred, and technologies like tanks, gas, and eventually nuclear weapons would reshape the meaning of invasion. The line between speculative fiction and reality blurred. Wells didn't just write about futuristic warfare, he foresaw it. And The War of the Worlds wasn't his only eerie hit. In later works, he predicted things like aerial bombing campaigns, surveillance states, even the atomic bomb. In 1914, he described a weapon so powerful it could destroy entire cities decades before Oppenheimer made it real. This wasn't just imagination, it was vision. Wells's brain seemed to orbit a few decades ahead of the rest of the species. His stories weren't dreams, they were warning shots. And then came 1938. Orson Welles broadcast a dramatized version of The War of the Worlds on American radio. The result? Widespread panic. Listeners thought the invasion was real, highways jammed. People prayed. Some prepared to fight. Wells had written fiction, but it was so disturbingly plausible that the line between story and reality collapsed. It's a reminder. Sometimes, the future isn't imagined, it's remembered early. And speaking of remembering dates a little too well, the next story brings us to a trio of English kings, one shared date and one royally strange coincidence that turns the calendar into a cryptic executioner. The unlucky date for kings. Some dates echo, not because of superstition, but because death has a habit of remembering its appointments. The 14th of October is one of those detessa, seemingly random point on the calendar that, for three English kings, marked their very last chapter. The first was Harold Godwinson in 1066, England's last Anglo-Saxon king, who took an arrow to the eye at the Battle of Hastings and lost both his crown and his country in one violent afternoon. His death marked the Norman Conquesta's seismic shift in English history that reshaped everything from language to law. Fast forward nearly 5 centuries. Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty, also died on the 14th of October, 1509. While his reign was less cinematic than Harold's, it was still significant. He ended the Wars of the Roses, restored royal stability, and set the stage for the rise of his infamous son Henry VIII. Then came Edward VI, the boy king, Protestant reformer, and tragic footnote. He died on the 14th of October, 1553, just 16 years old, after a short and sickly reign. His death threw England into a maelstrom of religious conflict, paving the way for Mary I and her bloody attempt to reverse the Reformation. 3 kings, 3 centuries apart, one shared death date. Coincidence? Definitely, but it's a deeply unsettling one. This wasn't a holiday or a battlefield anniversary. The 14th of October had no grand ritualistic significance until history decided to stack its bones there. It's almost as if the monarchy had unknowingly booked the same calendar slot for disaster. And what's left is a date that should feel meaningless but doesn't. It feels marked, cursed even. And now, as we leave the royal crypts behind, we travel to the heart of 2 cities. Twin capitals, each born under stars centuries apart, yet strangely aligned by destiny and a shared birthday. The Twin Cities, more. Washington, D.C., and Paris, France. On the surface, they couldn't be more different. One, the epicenter of modern democracy in the New World, the other, an ancient city of revolution, art, and empire. But these 2 capitals share something uncanny. They were both founded under similar stars, though centuries and cultures apart. One was carved from swampland and political ambition, the other from Celtic foundations and Roman plans, and yet their destinies are oddly twinned. Let's start with the numbers. Washington, D.C. was officially founded on the 16th of July, 1790, a political compromise written into stone. Paris, on the other hand, traces its legendary founding to around 300 B.C., when a Celtic tribe known as the Parisii settled along the banks of the Seine. On the face of it, these cities were born nearly 2 millennia apart, but the historical symmetry isn't in the dates, it's in the roles they played and the strangely parallel arcs they followed. Both cities became epicenters of revolutionary fervor. Paris had 1789 storming the Bastille, guillotines, the Reign of Terror. Washington emerged from the aftermath of the American Revolution, a purpose-built capital for a fledgling democracy forged in fire. Within 1 year of D.C.'s founding, France would enter its own historic upheaval. They weren't just cities, they were symbols, testaments to human reinvention, built not from tradition but from upheaval. And if that's not eerie enough, both cities have monuments that mirror one another. The wide boulevards of Paris inspired D.C.'s layout. The Washington Monument and the Eiffel Tower both vertical exclamation point stand as symbols of national identity, and both cities have been at the heart of world-shaping treaties, summits, and standoffs. In cultural memory, they act like reflective surfacosone representing freedom by design, the other, freedom by blood. Coincidence? Possibly, but it feels more like Destinia, transatlantic echo of ideals.